that retired early, and I work on what you would perhaps consider philosophy, or I would call the science of decidability. And the result is what we would call natural law, or the strict construction of ethics in law.
Right. So if we're having ethics as a part of this, I assume natural law would indeed be normative, correct?
No. So think of it like this: is that um, we know what we know what ethics means, in other words, or morality means, know the science of it. The problem is that the context for applied ethics varies across circumstance, because causality is dense in any given circumstance. So, in this sense, we can explain whether any normative ethical claim is in fact ethical or not, um, and we can both state what is ethical, period, and whether some ethical claim, in other words, in high causal density, in other words, context, would is in fact ethical or not.
Okay, so whether some sort of normative proposition is indeed ethical or whether it's non-ethical.
Because
Um,
we know empirically what ethics is. We've exhausted the test of it, and so it's not really complicated. The problem is that people, it's like geometry. It's like, well, a triangle has this many angles, but what are we trying to measure with this triangle? And so the system of measurement exists, and that's obviously universal. The problem is that the context for it is, quite deep, and so you're confusing the sum of us, the fact that there's ethics is a clear definition or clear measurement, but the sum of measurements in a context may be may be ethical or not. In other words, causal density is quite rich.
so maybe to try and help me understand this, would this be tying into what the discussion you and Walter Block had, where you said something along the lines of a just society is one which can survive. So it's this empirical determination of, it's I could propose any sort of norm I want, but if it doesn't actually apply and it couldn't actually bear out into a surviving society, then it's non-ethical. Is that sort of what you're getting at?
That's one of the that would be like an upper bound question. In other words, so we use the concept of a line, right? But it turns out that this is really useful idea at human scale, but there are no lines beyond human scale. There are only curves. So the same thing with that statement is that there are, if you claim something is ethical, but in the end result, in other words, over it's basically Kantian imperative. If everybody did it, or if it was done a lot over time and space, it would result in extermination or something. Then it can't be ethical.
So would the Rothbardian ethic result in extermination?
It's just impossible. That's why it doesn't exist.
Well,
In
how
other
is it
words,
impossible?
you can't bring it into being. The reason we don't have any libertarian societies is they're not survivable in the competition against other societies. And the reason being that libertarian ethics place too great a constraint on the production of commons for the group to produce a commons competitive enough to survive competition from others. And it's why there aren't any libertarian societies and never will be. Why I try to say stay away from Rothbard and just go back to natural law. So,
So, what exactly does it mean to have a creation of commons? Because you use that phrase in the block debate as well. I'm confused by what that
how do we
means.
bring the institution of property into being?
Well,
You
as
know, you
oh, sorry, I didn't realize you were still going.
so you and I can demonstrate an interest in something, right? We can obtain possession of it physically, we can defend it, but our ability to defend our demonstrated interest and our possession of it is limited by our ability to project the force necessary to protect it. So we enfranchise others in the defense of one another's demonstrated interests. And we scale this franchise to the point where we can reasonably defend, at least probabilistically, against competitors who would choose to deprive us otherwise. So that's simply how the institution of property did evolve and how it must evolve. Now, we eventually call this thing property or mine, but when we talk about property in the legal sense, in other words, in the political sense, it means we've also determined that there's an insurer. In other words, we've produced courts or sheriffs or some group of people or some mechanism, some institution for deciding. And the problem, of course, is that demonstrated interest is often difficult to decide because you and I might have different understandings of that demonstrated interest. Time has shown that's a relatively easy problem to solve, but in general, we must come to some set of agreement on the scope of what demonstrated interests, what we call property, will be defended either by you and I, by the group, or by the polity. In other words, people who produce an institution for the defense of it and the resolution of disputes over it.
So maybe to try and wrap that up into terms that I might understand, I'll try and give you a steel man of what you said. So it sounds a lot like, the Rothbardian ethic. It's an invalid formulation of property rights, because to have an institution of property rights, any sort of system of property rights, you need to defend those property rights. And, so you need an insurer of the property, and that needs to be some sort of institution, a polity, or something like that. Is that
correct? So the escalation or the evolutionary path is undemonstrated interest, demonstrated interest, possession, right? Defense, reciprocal defense, right? Which is when we go from it, at which point we have, if we get an institution, we now have property. So property is a legal term that exists for the purpose of determining a standard of weight and measure by which a group resolves disputes over demonstrated interests.
I mean, is it the case that we need these property rights to be defended for them to exist? Because, I mean, we could imagine the reductio case of all property rights being always defended, so no property right is ever violated. Well, that would mean we'd never have any disputes over anything as it pertains to the theory of property.
If you never had any disputes, you would never have property.
Yes, but so, it's self-defeating if we need to have defense of property to have a theory of property.
If you can't have property unless you need to defend it, it's non-logical. If you don't have to defend it, why do you need a thing called property?
Okay, so I think I understood that wrong. But then we get back to, why exactly does the Rothbardian ethic provide a theory of property where you don't need to defend that property? Because you do, in fact, it's if you want to have, whenever you're going to have a property rights dispute, a dispute over any scarce means, it's necessarily the case that you are trying to defend your property right. If you weren't trying to do anything with it, then you would have just acceded it into nature.
Let's fix this first. You keep using this term. Define a right.
So property rights are these conflict-avoiding norms. So, in the Hoppian sense. So if you have it that we start from conflict avoidance, a property right over, say, my beer can here would mean that if there was a dispute between me and anyone else over this beer can, because I have the property right, I ought to win it in that dispute. I would be the just winner of that dispute, you could say.
Right. So who decides?
Well, it's decided by the laws of logic. If we're having a natural theory of property rights, i.e. a natural law theory, it arises out of logic.
Okay, so now there's two paths. Who decides, though? Who decides? The difference is Rothbardian ethics is polylogical. So who's decided what that right is?
So
Because this is
who decided to call that what the right is? Who decided to define property rights in this way?
Who decides whether this adheres to what right?
Are we talking about like a specific instantiation, i.e. there's literally a dispute going on, or are we talking about...
There's a dispute going on, who decides what's right?
Well, the laws of logic decide. It isn't the person who's deciding what's right.
That can't be done. An action has to take place for a resolution to play. So you have to accept it, and the other party has to accept it.
Well, not necessarily.
Both parties have to be forced to accept it.
Yeah, well, I mean, like, it would, let's say the unjust winner, the unjust person, they win out the dispute. That's possible, but they would be objectively acting criminally. That's the point.
Well, but it doesn't matter, right? You're just using words. You're pretending words have meaning.
Well, it has plenty of meaning. It has a meaning as to what you should do.
So you can call a guy a criminal, but if he decides he's right and he thinks he's right, and he thinks you were a criminal, you haven't decided anything. What is the means by which the decision's enforced?
But
I'm going to take your beer can.
I'm
just going to take your beer can.
Right, it's mine. But
I decided, and I decided our logic is wrong, and I'm going to take your beer can.
But you'd be objectively in the wrong. You would be embroiled in contradiction in trying to propose.
Be objective. Who's deciding objectively?
If it would be like if I would try to propose that this both is my beer can and isn't my beer can at the same time. Well, I'd be wrong.
Reductio example. Use a real world example where people dispute investment.
Well, it's the same in any real world example. When you have a dispute, how
many times do people believe they're in the right when there's a dispute over interest? All the time.
Yeah. That doesn't mean they're all right. People are incorrect.
Well, the problem is who decides who's incorrect.
Well, the laws of logic. It isn't a person dictating who's...
A judge decides, right?
Well, no, because the judge is just simply determining... The ideal judge would be determining who's right. But the laws of logic have already played out, and there will be an objectively correct individual there in that dispute, and an objectively incorrect individual. That's what makes it a natural law rather than a positive law.
That doesn't matter. The argument is what is the reason we're in disputes? I always start with the what?
Scarcity.
Or just want. If the classical example is my family's been living here 200 years, and you're trying to do something to the territory that imposes a cost on me.
Okay.
Right, and so those people have, in their terms, a normative, what's considered a reasonable expectation that costs won't be imposed on them, right? And so they don't feel that they need to defend against them the costs because they have a reasonable expectation that costs won't be imposed on them. So which in the libertarian sense is usually brought up by the railroad and fire example, or the homesteaded land example. But if I have a reasonable expectation of something, I believe you've violated my rights. You've caused a discount to the value of my property, right? And so who's right?
Well, we can determine who's right by, analyzing it logically, because this whole idea of reasonable expectation, well, that's just a subjective preference. They feel like they shouldn't have to, have these costs imposed, whatever those costs may be, right? But whether I'm actually a criminal is something that needs proven.
Right, but okay, so let's prove it. You come in and you do that, and it depreciates my land. Why shouldn't I retaliate against you Tell me why I don't kill you and stop you from doing what you're doing.
If it's illegal, then you could not possibly justify it, so it's something you objectively ought not do.
But it is legal because in my mind you've just stolen from me.
Right, but this is an indefensible position on the law. It's an
Why is it
unproposable
indefensible?
system of
You
law.
imposed a cost on me. That's a fact.
Okay, but that's irrelevant.
No, it's a fact. You imposed a cost on me. What is the purpose of the law?
The purpose of the law is to deal with
prevent
disputes.
retaliation cycles. They prevent violence, prevent force, prevent repetition.
Well, the best way to prevent any retaliation would be to have everybody kill themselves right now. So is that the natural law, to have everybody
Let's
dead?
go through that chain of argument then. Is that why shouldn't we commit suicide? Let's start with Camus. Why not commit suicide?
Well, I mean, I would say not, because you could not propose an ethic of suicide.
Well, sure it can. Suicide
No,
is highly ethical. Societies have done it throughout all history. So murder.
You can't propose it without contradiction.
Women have killed more of their children out of necessity than men have killed one another in war.
So let's go through and let's see what happens if we tried to say that. Let's say I just said right now I ought to kill myself. Well, then what exactly am I doing sitting here arguing? Why? Well, if I'm saying I ought to, I've contradicted myself, because I'm demonstrating that I prefer not killing myself to killing myself. So I demonstrate that this is an ought that I do not actually apply. I'm just saying words. I'm not actually proposing this as something to be taken seriously. Otherwise, I'd be killing myself right now.
In the original question is really simple. Why don't you commit suicide?
Because I prefer not to. That's why I don't. But I could not propose that you ought to kill that.
That's not a question. The question is why.
Well, it is a question.
Well, I mean that's a generalizing a specific question. The answer for you can ask any individual, why don't you commit suicide? And the answer is the opportunity to experience more life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That we prefer to live under most circumstances other than utter despair. We prefer to live versus not. We're always buying the opportunity for persistence.
Yeah, so, I mean, people will always do what they prefer.
Why don't I kill you and take your stuff and your women and your kids? Why don't
I? Well, are we talking about literally the facts of the situation, or why shouldn't you?
I'm trying to make sure that we understand we're talking about the difference between science, philosophy, and theology. And I'm trying to show the scientific basis for why sophistry fails. So let's go just answer the simple question: why don't I kill you and take your stuff?
Like,
in history,
specifically,
that happens all the time.
I need to get down like what the specific question is. Are you saying why should you / shouldn't you, or literally why are you not currently killing me? Like, which of those questions?
I don't. Should is an interesting question. Should is an ideal. I'm asking the practical question. Given the opportunity to kill you and take your things, why wouldn't I?
Well, again, so are you asking the latter question of would you literally, if you didn't, why didn't you?
Correct.
Yeah, which is obviously because you preferred not to. That's going to be the case with any action. Well, I don't know why your preferences are the way they are. It's just you value me being alive more than killing me.
So there has to be some value to not killing you.
Yeah, whether it be opportunity cost or whatever.
All right. So, can you enumerate what those values are? In other words, what are the possible reasons I wouldn't kill you and take your stuff? If presented with the opportunity.
Well, it could be that the opportunity cost involved in actually going ahead and killing me is too high, so you'd rather not. Or it could be that you value me being alive more than me not being alive. So that could be another example.
So I might be buying an option on future opportunities for cooperation and trade, for example.
And that could be the case, yep.
All right. And why shouldn't me and mine kill you and yours and take your stuff? Because that's really the most profitable industry you can get into.
Well, you shouldn't, because you couldn't justify this. So you objectively shouldn't.
I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying.
Well,
why wouldn't I can do it. I can't see a reason why not to do it. So why not do it? Give me some reason not to kill you and take your stuff.
Well, the reason not to kill me is because you could not justify this. Therefore, you objectively ought not do it.
I justify it by the gain I get out of it.
Well,
I
that's
would
not
gain
justifying it,
by
though.
killing you and taking your women and taking your horses.
But you haven't justified it, though.
I'm not trying to justify it.
Right, so yeah, but like when we are speaking in ethics, we're speaking about justifying why you ought to do something.
Science. I'm talking science.
I mean, ethics is a science.
I'm trying to prevent you from playing the game. And so what's the answer is that the causal difference is, why don't I kill you and why don't you commit suicide? Why don't I kill you and take your stuff? And why don't I and mine kill you and take your stuff?
Well,
why not? I mean, we did it throughout history.
The literal reason why you but these are animal beasts.
Longer, I gain by killing you. I gain by taking your stuff. We gain by killing all of you and taking all of your things, and we gain more so faster than we can by any other means.
Well, that doesn't mean you should do it, though.
That's not a should question. Do people do it?
Yes, people obviously do it, which is why we have to spend so much time thinking about why they shouldn't do it.
Oh, there has to be a reason for them to should not do it.
Yes, which is argumentation ethics.
So that you have to go back to it. Why should you haven't given me a reason why I shouldn't kill you?
Because it's unjustifiable. Therefore, you objectively ought not do it.
Justifiable to whom? You already said
anyone. You could not justify it. It's not possible to justify it.
Justify it to anybody.
Right, you don't have to, but right, but if you care about justifying your actions, then
I don't care. But why do I need to? Where did that come from?
But if you care at all about shoulds and should nots, then you care about why exactly should I do this as opposed to this?
Why would I even think of not killing you and taking your stuff if I can?
Because you're rational.
No, it's rational to take your stuff.
It's not.
I mean, that's why we did it in history.
It's absolutely not rational.
Why is it rational?
It's
completely irrational. I gained in the shortest time, with the least effort, with the lowest degree of risk, with the greatest degree of certainty, with the lowest cost. I have killed you, taken your stuff, and it's killing people and conquering is the most profitable.
And yet you ought not do it.
There's
all of that may be true.
Why
you
not?
Ought not do it.
Why not?
Objectively the case. You ought not do it. It's like exactly how
why not?
I mean, it's argumentation ethics. That's it.
The
alternative to try and propose the alternative would contradict yourself.
You have to answer the question. You're not answering the question. Why don't I kill you? And the answer is people do because it's rational.
Well, no, it's
what makes it
rational in the Misesian sense, maybe.
Sorry?
Not rational in the Misesian sense, but not rational in the sense I'm speaking.
Well, I mean, you're making that up, right? So the question, rational, meaning it is rational in the sense that my actions will produce an outcome that I would prefer to choose versus the alternative.
So it's two different senses of the word rational, right? It's rational in the Misesian sense, in that you believe it will increase your utility. But it's irrational in the sense I'm speaking, in that you are not considering the reason. You're not considering ethics at all. You're not acting rationally. You're acting like some sort of animal beast.
Why would I consider ethics? There's no reason.
You objectively ought to consider ethics.
Why do we consider ethics? I'm trying to get you.
Because you want to live a good life.
Huh?
Because you want to live a good life. Ethics is about how to live a good life.
I'll trade Genghis Khan's life for mine any day. A lot of people will. You got a harem with 300 chicks. That's
because a lot of people don't understand ethics.
It's not you haven't got to the point where you understand what causes ethics to come into being. That's what you're doing. You're doing like, here's what Rothbard does. He does like there's non-aggression principle, but non-aggression against what? So it's a means of deception by suggestion by using an incomplete sentence. The reason libertarians never go anywhere is because they use this sophistry of an ideal type to never state what the scope of aggressions are that people will retaliate against that destroy the cooperation necessary to reform polities at scale. So it's really trivial sophistry. I'm just trying to get to the basics. You haven't explained why someone develops a sense of ethics.
Well, because
why did ethics evolve so slowly from it was okay to kill people in your tribe under certain stances till it wasn't? It was okay to kill people in neighboring tribes until it wasn't. You haven't explained why ethics evolved the way it did, what the rational
I mean,
choice was
why
for
it
everybody anyway.
evolved isn't irrelevant to what ethics is. The history of ethics isn't relevant to what ethics is.
You don't know what the cause of ethics is.
No, I don't know what the cause of ethics is, whatever that
Or
means.
you don't have, you're just make up ethics as a first principle out of thin air.
Well, I'm not making it up, I'm determining it.
Well, I mean, you're choosing it out of thin air,
I'm
so
not
it's a
choosing it again.
theological.
To try and choose alternative ethics I would contradict myself. So I'm left with
Well,
only one choice.
right, you've stated an axiom. You haven't evolved a truth, discovered a truth, and
Well,
so
the axiom is true.
I'm trying to. That's what it is. So I'm trying to figure out what brings ethics into being.
Right, but that's
How does that come about? What
that's a
are the
separate question, right?
No, it's the question you're avoiding. So
Well, it's a
why
separate
are you
question.
avoiding
We can
saying,
talk about why ethics came into being if you want, but
sure, let's talk
I'm just
about it.
saying what ethics is. Okay, yeah, right, but we will get back to what ethics is. I'm going to note that down.
It's really easy what ethics is, but how does it come into being?
I don't know how it comes into
Why
being. I
do I
assume people
stop?
start,
Why do I
some
stop
Greek
killing
fella
you, and
probably
why do
started thinking about
us
odds, I
stop killing
imagine.
you and yours? Why do people do that? Why do people stop killing and robbing and pillaging and raping others and then other groups? Why do we do that?
Well, they probably start considering, the philosophy of, well, should I do this? And then, throwing that around in their head a bit, thinking about whether or not they should do it. And then, some Greek guy probably said something, a little bit later we have Hoppe saying, yeah, no, you shouldn't do that. And
So
then everything was
you think
peaceful.
so? It wasn't the practical reality of the problem of defending yourself against others. The practical
Yeah,
reality of the value of
that's probably why
cooperation.
people stopped invading others, but that's not actually caring about ethics. They're not stopping. They're not that. We're talking about the origin of ethics here. We're not the origin of why people just so happened to start acting more ethically. Why did they choose, because it's more ethical, to start acting more ethically? And that's because ethics is telling you how you ought to live.
So how did those people who wrote down the long history of ethical invention, how did they come to the conclusion that something was ethical? You're just evading. You're just using
Well,
circular
I
logic
don't
to
know
avoid the
I don't
point.
know how they did it. I do it
Well, I mean
through
that's the point.
I do it through
Is
the
you
law of
don't.
non-contradiction. Right, but
No, you just don't
so
know. That's
yeah,
why you're
I've
grasping
said
at
that many
ideals,
times. Is this relevant
right?
though?
No, it's relevant because
All right,
the
so then
answer
how did they
is
do
this
it?
allows you to justify Rothbardian ethics because you artfully ignore the causality
I'm not
behind it.
ignoring it. I just haven't read
Yeah,
about
you
the
are.
fucking
You're
full
ignorant
history
of
of
it and you
philosophy,
ignore it.
dude.
So
I'm not ignoring it. I'm not ignoring things I don't know.
right, no, but you can't. That's a conflation of voluntary and involuntary. You could choose in this conversation to try to understand the evolution
Well,
of
that's what I'm
ethics.
trying to do. That's why I'm asking you. Okay,
You
then
keep
what? Then how
disagreeing
did
with
it
me.
happen? And you're just
You
saying you
keep
don't know.
avoiding
Ha
it.
ha ha. Okay, right. So then how did it happen?
How did it happen was exactly that. As the scale of cooperation increased, the utility of non-aggression decreased. That's it.
So
And
as
so,
there's more, let's just unpack that. So as there's more cooperation, non-aggression becomes less important.
you know, aggression becomes less important.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say non-aggression becoming less. Yeah,
In other
yeah.
words,
So
as the
as
scale of cooperation happens, and this is just a matter of the technology available and the means of production. And so all that happens is production increases, population increases, the cost of imposing your will by taking it on others there increases to the point where you reach the tipping point that it's more advantageous to cooperate with the tribe next door than to be in a place where you're continually losing 10 to 40% of your males every year to try to steal shit from each other. So that's where it comes from. So ethics began in the band, which is the small family, and it eventually grew out. And we see this today still in those societies that exist to perpetuate it. So ethics is simply one simple rule, that one, which is it's just a better alternative, then, people retaliate for the imposition of costs upon their demonstrated interests, and the way you avoid retaliation and you buy cooperation is to not impose costs upon their demonstrated interests. The problem is we vary in what we consider demonstrated interests. This is the problem with the non-aggression principle. It's a sophistry because it's half true. The problem is it's like saying something is good but better than what? And so a non-aggression, but the problem is that we all agree on non-aggression. What we
No, we don't
disagree
all
is
agree.
against what? Sorry?
We don't all agree on non-aggression. There are people who are going around aggressing all the time.
As those of us who are in a position to decide conflicts and impose restitution, punishment, and prevention, which are the three commands of the three requirements of dispute resolution, whenever those of us in a position to do it, that's what the decision criteria we make is. Sure, there are people who aggress all the time because, like I said, it has to be more in your interest not to than to do so. So what we do is we create institutions which cause this is what I get teased for all the time, the incremental suppression of irreciprocity against people's demonstrated interest. We call this the law, we call this norms, we call this manners, but it's just a norm, whatever the normative structure is that suppresses irreciprocity within this structure of this various set of structures of production. So in the end, that what we're really trying to do is, the reason we have ethics is to maximize the returns on cooperation by incremental suppression of irreciprocity by all sorts of methods. But then the whole point is that we drive people to the fringe, and those fringe people still find it more desirable to kill people, beat people, steal from people, rape, pillage, whatever, than they do, organized crime, rent-seeking, what we libertarians call statism or corruption. These things all develop out of the basic rational choice to get away with whatever we can because the institutions of suppression are not sufficient to capture all different cases. That's why the law never ends and why the common law was so valuable and why the Anglos discovered the modern state is because it's the most hyper-adaptive means of forcing hyper-adaptation of the population because we don't have to do anything systemic or intentional in order to suppress a newly discovered means of irreciprocity that we call a crime. So, I mean, the whole point of ethics is we're trying to increase cooperation because we're trying to decrease all the negativities that go along with non-cooperation.
Or rather, let's even get down to what it means to cooperate versus not cooperate, right? What is anti-ethical action versus what is ethical action, right? What is crime and what is non-crime? Right?
So we can say we can lay down the rules of what is amoral, moral, and virtuous, and equally amoral, unethical, immoral, and evil. We can lay down those criteria, but as we've said, the systems of production, association, cooperation, reproduction, production, commons, polities, and war, that whole incredible spectrum and everything in between it that we engage in may depend on various trades that already exist. In other words, a portfolio. So what may be unethical and immoral in one case, it may be ethical and moral in another, or it may be ethical and moral at a certain scale, but not ethical and moral at a larger scale. So I mean, that's where this is why ethics is such a problem, is because we confuse what's ethical for me, in other words, what's rational for me to pursue, in given my returns, what's ethical for my family, for my clan, for my tribe, for my nation, for my polity, for my state, for my empire, for my civilization. I mean, these things vary because the terms at which it's rational for us to act to not cause retaliation vary according to this vast dense circumstance. What we want is a general rule. In other words, we want a general rule for determining what's ethical. We
Yeah.
can. The problem is the knowledge required for a virtue ethic, which is what I would say a Rothbardian ethic is, a rule-based ethic and an outcome-based ethic are an increasing incline of demand for knowledge very few of us possess. So I might be a child and want to have a virtue ethic, and so it is good if I do this, right? And I could have an adult and I say, well, there are sort of rules that bind us, and I could be an established person with a lot of life experience across a lot of domains and say, well, the outcomes of these actions produce these things. The problem is you can't ask everybody to have ultimate knowledge, and you can't ask people with ultimate responsibility even to have that knowledge. You have to simply just tolerate the noise that happens as people do their best in this vast chaos that generally progresses towards something successful despite our many failures.
Right. So what is specifically the fault with, say, the non-aggression principle? Like, what would be a counterexample of something which you should do, which is aggressive?
The canary in the coal mine is the example I use with
So what would be the
which is
canary in the coal mine?
block.
Like literally throwing a canary down a coal mine?
No, I mean it's the easiest, the one that tells one of the obvious and simple example is blackmail. So, according to Rothbardian ethics, they only require that an action is voluntary. In order to warranty it, you must specifically demand warranty. And if it's voluntary and unwarranted, then it's not warranted, and you're not liable. This is the ethics of the Pale or the Bazaar. In other words, it's the Middle Eastern Bazaar. Right? Whereas European ethics are the ethics of, I call them Viking ethics to create a bit of humor. But it's that if we're creating a trade, it doesn't matter what you promise me. This thing needs what I ask you. You're promising this thing is fit for use, and if it isn't, you're warranting it. And if you don't warrant it, I'm going to kill you. So that's sort of the European ethic of things, or the Vikings would say it. It's better to trade than pillage you, because eventually you run out of stuff to pillage. So trade is better. So we have rule of law ethics, which is warranty and liability, and the Bazaar, the Middle East, doesn't have it. They don't have truth before face. We have truth before face. They don't have warranty and liability. We have warranty and liability. And the second thing is they don't have commons, and we have commons, because commons turns out to be the competitive advantage of Western people. In any event, what you asked me, the specific question, which was, what's an example, is is blackmail a voluntary exchange under Rothbardian ethics? Yes, it's a voluntary exchange. I got something, you got something. But under European ethics, which are warranty and liability, the test is it productive? It wasn't productive, it was unproductive. Is it fully informed? Might have been, I don't know. Is it voluntary? It's coerced. Is it warranted? It's unwarrantable that you won't do it again. Are you liable for it? Well, you're not liable to redo it voluntarily because you're not warranting it. And is it restitutable? No, you can't provide restitution for it if I can't trust you. So the long cause here is that blackmail's an irreciprocal exchange, and I will retaliate against you for your effort at blackmail. So the problem is blackmail is a great test of the difference between Rothbardian ghetto ethics and European aristocratic ethics.
So you said there, blackmail is something which is coerced. I mean, in what sense is it coerced? How are you being coerced when you're having blackmail?
I will want to retaliate against you because it's unproductive. In other words, I'm not getting anything in exchange. I'm just not you're forcing me to give up something or to experience a harm. There's no difference between put a dagger at my chest and blackmailing me if these things are both coming to harm.
So it's coercion because the blackmailed will want to retaliate against the blackmailer.
Well, the retaliation is the evidence that it's coerced.
But what about an instance where the blackmail doesn't want to retaliate?
What do you mean? I'm being blackmailed and you don't want to retaliate? I don't want to
Well,
retaliate.
yeah. What if you found out I take a bath with a rubber ducky, and you blackmail me for this, and I give you over some money, and I don't want to retaliate against you? What about that situation?
Well, I mean, that's not. That's like it's a crime of insufficient value
But
that
why is
you
it a
would
crime if it's
retaliate against
non-coerced?
because it's an unproductive. It is coerced. You're just saying that you don't want to retaliate.
No,
against
it's not coerced because you said it's coerced because the blackmailed is retaliating against it, and that is what makes it coercion.
In other words, coercion is the evidence of it happening, correct? But that's different from that's a great example of how the general rule is true, yet the specifics of the thing may vary. It doesn't violate the general rule that in general reciprocity requires productive, fully informed, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests within the limits of warranty and liability.
What exactly are you meaning by coercion here?
Sorry?
What exactly are you meaning by coercion here?
The involuntary, the cause of a transfer of demonstrated interests without an exchange of demonstrated interest.
Can we just unpack that there? What does it mean by a transfer of demonstrated interests?
You want to use this example?
Yeah, for the example of blackmail, what are
Well,
the demonstrated interests being transferred?
Let's say I messed around with my secretary, something I've been accused of repeatedly and never have done. So let's say I've accused of it. Somebody says he's going to he's going to use an email or a photo to misrepresent that I've been fooling around with my secretary, right? This is going to cause me an extraordinary amount of status harm, right? And so, and the problem with harming my status is it will ruin or harm the my discount and opportunity costs because I have status. That's what status provides. So so I pay you, right, as the blackmailer, because it's frankly cheaper to make this go away than it is to fight it. In other words, if I don't pay you, you do this, it's a pain in my ass, right? So I've been coerced. But, it's like, I'm going to pay you and I'm not going to retaliate against you because I think it's fucking...
Whoa. But that doesn't... Why does that imply that it's coercion, though? You just kind of slip that in there. It might be a pain in your ass, right? But I'm allowed to be a pain in your ass. What makes it criminal? What makes it coercion?
Let's try the general rule again, see if you can get it. Productive. It's a checklist. This is what courts do.
Yeah, this is under European ethics. What makes this European ethics, right? You said it's productive, fully informed, warranted, yeah, etc.
Because I'm trying to illustrate that European ethics have evolved the closest to natural law, and the international law is a demonstration that all ethics converge on natural law.
What makes this not natural? Surely that it exists in logic, right? That's pretty natural. That would be a good candidate for a natural law. If it's a law which exists in logic, what makes your European ethics a better candidate for natural law, given that it was ascribed by the states?
Because the empirical evidence says it's correct. It has a broader range of decidability, suppressing more irreciprocity than all others. So I mean, it's just the empirical. I'm saying that there's two. So empirically, it's the case, and logically, it's explicable. And it's explicable from first principles. So it as far as we know, it can't be false. What you can say is, I'm going to deviate from this ethics because I'm willing to pay the costs of deviating from it. People do that. People practice, governments sponsor religion despite the harm they cause, right? Because there's a trade-off. So people make decisions. I'm not going to retaliate against you for trying to fraud up something against my wife because my reputation, because frankly, it's just not worth me not paying you. That doesn't mean you didn't coerce the payment out of me. It means that it wasn't, and it still fit the criteria of that it failed fully productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interest, free of externality against the demonstrative interest of others. If we look at all claims of irreciprocity, that's the checklist. So that's the general rule. That's the system of measurement.
But
So,
this,
like I said in the beginning, when you have an individual case, you can say, how does this vary from the system, from this in the standard of weights and measures? Just like how does this vary from 6 pounds, right? It varies from these checklists. And so when you say that, you say, okay, well, in this particular case, we're judging this case in the Saudi Arabia, and they don't use all these checklists, or we're doing this there. They don't, but it doesn't mean that the checklist doesn't provide decidability regardless of context. So if I'm in a high trust Western society, I'm going to see there's going to be a low trust, let's say Middle Eastern or African society. The commons, in other words, the common law between them, might differ, but it doesn't mean both sides won't be explicable by the general rule. In other words, what I'm talking about is just physics. It's not really, it has to be this way because the physics of the universe operate this way, and humans are bound by physics. And all this bubbles up through the fact that we just have the ability to remember, speak, and voluntarily choose our action. But in the end, humans are part of the physical system, and either you're gaining or losing calories from every exchange. And so people do what's logical by not only the laws that are the logic that's conscionable to them, but they're behaving the logic of the universe underneath it. This is why we know it's natural law, because it's a law of nature. We just happen to use the tradition natural law because we want to describe the history of the evolution of this idea of an optimum rules of cooperation, just like we use the history of the laws of nature to slowly develop the form. I mean, there's only 4 sets of laws, right? The physical laws of the universe, the behavioral laws of the universe, and the evolutionary laws of the universe, and the logic we use to describe them, or the grammars we use to describe them. There's only 4 sets of laws. And why? Because they're the before condition, the during condition, the after condition, and the logic we use to explain the before, during, and after conditions of each one of these things, which allows us to actually think and reason. So the laws of the universe are relatively simple, and this is just the fact that natural law is coherent with physical law is just evidence that the coherence between physical, natural, and evolutionary laws is pretty obvious once you know all 3 sets of them, and it becomes pretty clear that consistency is why that natural law exists.
Right. So let's just get real down and dirty into this example, because it seems like you've gone all over the place with this European ethics into, there's all these Viking ethics, and then we go down to physics, and then, we're talking about all this stuff. Let's just get real down and dirty. Why is it a criminal action to engage in blackmail? I.e., why is it something that is just to prevent?
What's a criminal action is one that the group has determined they will enforce, right, as a general rule. And just as in many things, we don't enforce all jaywalking, but we have jaywalking rules, right? We enforce those things that we feel need to be enforced because general rules accommodate the maximum number of cases that are inside the margins of worthy action. In other words, it's practical. Now, when you say group, I'm saying the group is willing to enforce. That might be you and me and my family, you and me and our families. It might be the 10 of us in our tribe. It might be the sheriffs and the police and the judges and the lawyers and the politicians and the past generation of lawmakers that have decided it. Who knows? But the general rule remains the same of what's irreciprocal and reciprocal, but how we will apply that rule in the given social and economic and political and military and geostrategic context will vary, but the general rule remains the same. It's like gravity. There's always gravity, but the cases which we apply it differ.
Okay, so, right back to the start. So blackmail is a crime because the group has determined that it's a crime. What does it mean for the group to determine that it's a crime?
Blackmail generates blackmail as a general rule under the distribution of cases of damage.
No. Not that blackmail as a general rule. No, as in we're generally blackmailing. As in, why is it the case that blackmail is something which should be prohibited?
I don't want to get... If you can't manage what I'm saying, there's no way I'm getting into set theory. Let's just stick with it as there's a distribution of crimes of blackmail from very simple to very serious, right? I'll kill you immediately for bringing it up, and I'll ignore you, right? In the distribution, we've developed a general rule that describes the criteria for blackmail. This civilization has decided that we have a problem with blackmail, and so we're going to outlaw it.
Right, but look, yeah, you just slipped it in again. This group has decided. A group can't decide something. What exactly? Individuals can decide things, and they can determine it in a group context. But what does it mean for the group to decide something?
Well, a group evolves. In any group where there's a pattern of conflict, people evolve norms, traditions, values, institutions, and laws, right? That's what they do, all of them. Mm-hmm. They develop religious laws, they develop tribal laws, they develop extended laws, they develop imperial laws. They have some degree of them. They tend to be very specific at the low level and very broad at the top level. But a law is a general rule that's evolved from observations of the need to suppress irreciprocities. That's what happens. They evolve in a group for the suppression of them. And across all groups, we can identify, this is where the word common in common law comes, those things that groups have in common. And that things that we have in common are general rules. We can look at all those general rules, and we can look at the decision criteria for all those general rules. The set of general rules underneath those commons is one called weak irreciprocity. And the criteria for checklist of irreciprocity across all those commons, across all those applications, is what we call the demand for reciprocity, or the demand for non-imposition against the demonstrative interest or others. And that is what I keep repeating: productive, fully informed, warranted, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interest free of imposition of cost against the demonstrated interest of others. I should have put it within the limits of liability and restitutability. So that's what the scope is. That's the complete scope. Does that mean everybody uses it in every circumstance? No. But it means how groups decide. It's how groups evolve a decision criteria for it. And that's the science of how people do things. Right? Now, what we tend to do with philosophy is a proto-science. It's a bridge between theology and science. And so the problem with philosophy is just that, is that it evolved from the verbalism, lacking the evidence. It was pretty theoretical. So you get into this problem, what we call ethics. Are you talking about ethics of science? Are you talking about the ethics of an individual thinker? Are you talking about the ethics of a philosopher? Are you talking about the demonstrated interests of a polity? Are you talking about the demonstrated interests across multiple polities? Are you talking about the demonstrated interests across all polities, which would be natural law? So it's not...
The group has determined that it's a crime because there's this reciprocity deal going on.
Because people demand reciprocity in order to not retaliate. And so that's what the only rational reason to cooperate is that which is purely Misesian, right? Or at least it's not Misesian, it's it's marginalist. Is that the people will only make a choice if it's in their rational self-interest. And they do.
Okay, right.
There's no human action that isn't explicable.
This is essentially, you've described why the group has determined that it's a crime, but not actually what it means for a group to determine something.
But what do you mean? So what do you mean what it means? It's a description of a fact.
Because I know what it means for a person to determine something. That's pretty obvious to me. You know, I get that people can determine things, but I'm not a collectivist. I don't understand how a group can determine. As in, is it a majority determines that this should be a crime, and then the group has determined that it's a crime, or does the entire group have to determine that it's a crime for it to be a crime?
The common law, unlike the French continental law, unlike Jewish law or French law, or unlike is Muslim law, closer to Muslim law, it's purely empirical. A law is a thing that has evolved out of the resolution of disputes in an adversarial competition before a jury of our peers, the purpose of which is to maintain reciprocity and cooperation, which we think of as freedom, liberty, sovereignty, and self-determination. So the
Okay.
group evolves this. You don't have to have anybody decide it. You can make people decide things, in other words, legislation. But in general, under the common law, and we're a common law country, and we live in a common law civilization, and Rome was a common law civilization, and our pre-Roman, pre-Greek ancestors practiced the common law. There is no authority. That's what we call rule of law. So the people decide based on custom. Custom is the empirical history of the resolution of disputes. So over time, people discover, they don't determine, they discover, capture, and canonize the record of the general rules for the resolution of disputes. And we call that the common law.
So
now, what happened?
the group evolves this. Nobody has to decide it. So what it means for the group to determine that something is a crime is for there to be some custom within that group for something to be considered criminal. Is that accurate?
I don't know what that means, because I can say a custom could be...
I mean, I just spat your words back at you. So if you don't know what it means, I think we're in dire straits here.
I don't know what you mean. What I mean is the evidence that has been recorded in the record of the law, right? Record of disputes resolutions before an adversarial competition of a jury of peers results in the record of a general rule. In other words, results in a number of decisions producing a general rule of dispute resolution by what is a test of reciprocity in the context at hand. In other words, civilizations slightly differ.
Okay, right.
This is because civilizations slightly differ because, for example, if you live in a village, the village technically owns your house because the village built it, and it's your house as long as you're a good citizen of the village, but they can take it away from you. The same reason, like in English history, you can't sell your farm and run off with the money because now you've displaced the rest of the family and put a hazard on the commons. It's the same reason marriage is what it is. You can't, they don't want you having kids unless, and exporting cost upon the commons.
This sounds a hell of a lot like positive law, i.e. if the group in general is criminalizing something, then it is a crime. This sounds a whole lot like positive law, you know, i.e. if the state says something is a crime and you're criminalizing it, then it's a crime, right? This is not natural law, this is positive law.
People arbitrarily criminalize it.
I think they are arbitrarily doing it.
Hold on. There's 3 points we got to make when you try to bring in positive law. The purpose of positive law is to say there is no natural law. Whatever, we're going to find one of the 3 alternative means of claiming a command issued by a government is legitimate, and therefore you must obey it. Right? That's what positive law means. It means a command that is issued by the state under some claim of legitimacy, a false one, by the way, is what it is. Then that's true. People may also invent false legislation, right? So people may create proto-legislation or legislation. They may decide something is bad, and that is not a state-driven law. The legitimacy comes from the people making the claim. This is why natural commons evolve in some places. The third condition is the one I'm disputing your claim, which is that people do make mistakes in what they've considered irreciprocal. But the analysis of the common law's history is we're extremely good at flushing those laws out or ignoring them over time. So in general, the common law has been extremely effective. However, what our ancestors did is they said they made up a nice lie, just like the positive law liars did, is that they said legislation is the same as law. No, law is discovered, legislation is made, just like uh laws of the universe are discovered, the four sets of laws of the universe, but axioms are declared. This is the difference between a logic and a science, is that the laws are discovered from which we can produce an operational logic dependent on those laws. A logic that is pulled out of whatever is just declared axioms that are not dependent on those first principles, those physical laws to come from. So that's the difference between an operational law, what I do, and an ideal law or a verbal law or a constructivist law or a positive law or an axiomatic law or a logical law. So logic is declared by humans, and science is discovered by man by trial and error. So the common law, the natural law, is simply a discovery of the laws of nature by man.
Right. So how exactly are we discovering that blackmail is illegal? How are we going about that discovery? If it's not just legislation, i.e. the group has decided that we're going to criminalize this, because that would be legislation, how do we know that the group is just in their criminalizing of it?
Because by and large, people create retaliation cycles.
So what does that mean?
The origin of most law is a suppression of retaliation cycles because in most of history, men like you and I, brothers, cousins, whatever, are the enforcers of property rights. And so when polities got large enough, they had to develop standards, right? Which is a law is basically a standard of weights and measure. And this is why I say if we look at the first laws, they aren't really commands about what's legal and not. They're standards of punishment. That's because my clan will simply claim their clan can punish you for this, and your clan mine, and so we stop solving the problem. So the reason for the development of law is suppression of retaliation cycles, which is obvious still in tribal societies today. And secondly, it's the suppression of non of resistance to cooperation, which then suppressed the possibility for productivity in trade,
So
which then deprived the state of taxes.
It's a crime to do something which creates retaliation cycles. Would that be a good enough? That is how we're determining what a crime is. If it's something which creates a retaliation cycle, then it's criminal in nature.
Well, I mean, I would say it's unethical and immoral in nature, and then a crime is a thing like property once you've codified it. So I mean, I'm trying to dance around which time I can say, yeah, you're right enough for this, and this needs to be clear. A crime, like property, is a thing that institutions to decide. Or something you retaliate is just a fact of a scientific discovery of human behavior. So people tend to retaliate against impositions of cost against their demonstrated interest. So a thing that we should tend to, and we will tend to make a crime, is a thing that people retaliate against.
Whoa. What do you mean make a crime? Because you said legislation is not the same as law. So these crimes already exist in nature. So we're not making anything a crime. We're just determining what is a crime.
I didn't. You're just not trying. I know. I realize it's a lot, right? The fact is, we don't get taught the history of law and the history of economic development. So there's a tendency of people to go to literary nonsense in order to get the substitute because it's more accessible to them. I understand that that in any discipline, right, in any science, there's a lot of more stuff in there. There's a lot of causality and a lot of terms. I understand that, right? I get that this is not fun. I mean, we're
okay, but what was wrong about what I said there? You can Blovey on about how, like, I'm misunderstanding it, but what exactly am I misunderstanding here?
Is that a, a, that something that we discover through demonstrated behavior, those things that evolve into common law, judge discovered law. There is then some sort of proto legislation, some sort of legislation that's formal, some sort of command that can be issued, and some sort of regulation. And a regulation is merely the terms by which some existing law is enforced. So those are separate terms. We bundle all that in the law, but the only law is the natural law, and then we have judge discovered law on top of that. Then we have informal legislation. Then we have formal legislation, and then we have command, and then we have regulation. Across that spectrum, if we talk about how did the law develop, it developed by evidence that they want to suppress this court of crimes, and that's what the common law is, or book law, or judge discovered law. On top of that, yes, people do come to what would be under analysis wrong decisions in judge discovered law. It does happen. It's rarer than you'd think, but it does happen. People come up with stupid laws, right? Like the blue laws that still regulate lots of stuff in New England, like alcohol and sex and shit like that. And then you have formal legislation, which is produced by some state process and procedure according to some existing statutes and regulations. That's legislation formal. Then you just get out to outright commands, like shit that they make up and pull out of their ass, which is right. And then there's regulation. There's a huge planet. But the answer is that where all of this really important stuff happens, we call moral and ethical, isn't up here at the top where people are making stupid policy decisions. It's down here in what we consider fundamental rights and wrong. That's where we get angry. And that's the stuff that's judge discovered law. It doesn't have to be, it becomes codified through practice. In other words, people simply just say, because it's called judicial review, look, this judge, 100 judges have decided that this is the case with 100 juries, and they all came to the same conclusion, and I can't think of a reason to disagree with them. So therefore, I am justified in enforcing this decision on behalf of the polity, not because I'm smart, but because the evidence produced by the polity is that. So people produce blackmail as a demonstrated behavior. In other words, they outlaw behavior. They develop the outlawing of behavior because it's an irreciprocity. Right? It's an irreciprocity that happens to produce a disproportionate number of retaliation cycles. So we don't like it. This is why it's, we have such a moral crime. The problem is some things need to be reported even if they aren't blackmailed. That's something else. So any of it.
Okay, so I mean, you have this idea of, okay, right, 100 judges came to this decision, so therefore I'm just in doing it. Right? Is it because the 100 judges agree with you on doing it that you're allowed to do it? That's just to do?
It's because my assessment of the criteria, in other words, the checklist, which I seem to not be able to get across, but that's how the law decides, right? They develop general rules of criteria that have to be met for adjudications, and then they see if those criteria are met. And so this is how judgments are made in every court in the fucking planet, right? So you come out here and you say, okay, well, these judgments are state. Now, and I look at all the other judgments that have been made. And what will happen is opposing counsels will both present me with judgments in their favor. And I'll look at this and say, well, the jury said you're guilty. And according to the evidence I've got before me of the judgments that are made by others, according I have to the law as it's written, captured and generalized into a set of checklists, and according to the jury, this is all the case, then I'm going to issue in favor of the defendant. I mean, that's how it works. It's a boringly empirical process, which most people think has something to do with moral conviction. It doesn't. As a matter of fact, the lack of morality in court is one of the things I work against.
So I have this down here. Seeing if you could give me an analogous statement to crime is the initiation of conflict under Rothbardian natural law. It seems like would that analogous statement be, well, all these other people have determined that it's crime in their opinion as well? Or would there be some other statement where you could just give me some real concise, boom, this is how we determine what is and isn't crime, and we can apply this to any given action to know whether it's a crime?
Do you know what fraud by reductio is?
Nope.
That's it. It's saying that you want something in terms that fit your priors rather than
I'm not looking for in specific terms. I'm looking for it just to be nice and concise, i.e. just some algorithm that I could take and apply to any given action, and I could determine whether or not it is a crime. Right? Because that algorithm for me is a single sentence.
Morality,
right? Crime is the initiation of conflict.
What the difference between crime, ethics, and morality is direct. It is direct and verbal, and is indirect. So it's in other words, it's the spectrum of what we call morals. Right? The spectrum of morality.
Right, but could you give me such a sentence?
I am trying to do that, but I have to make sure that you aren't going to play the sophistry game with me. So I'm going to try it. What does moral mean? It's a spectrum from direct, like violence and harm and theft, right, to ethics, like fraud, to immorality, like bearing a child out of wedlock and forcing the cost upon the commons. So that's what those terms mean. They're a spectrum from one point to the other of the directness of the crime and given the awareness of the opposing party of it, right? That's what morals mean. Immorality, the general rule underneath that spectrum, is a test of reciprocity. Reciprocity requiring fully informed, productive, voluntary, a transfer of demonstrated interest, free of imposition of costs upon the demonstrated interests of others by externality, within the limits of warranty, liability, and restitution. So that's the checklist. That's what it is. I can't simplify it more than that. Right? So an immoral act, whether anywhere from crime to immoral to evil, right, it consists of a violation of those terms of reciprocity. Period. End of story. You can't make it simpler than that, because every time you try to simplify it, you make it easier for someone to lie. And what's our job? Is to prevent people from lying.
Right. Can you just run through them like, ding, 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 so I can get them written down, what the criteria set is for this immoral act? So we got violation of reciprocity.
Right. So productive.
So it's an immoral act if it is productive?
No. Do you want it? I'm going to give you what the test of a moral act is. Right?
Okay, you're giving me the test of a moral act.
Moral act.
And this will be a superset for for non-criminal acts, will it?
Huh?
So will this form the set of non-criminal actions?
If an action satisfies these criteria, it is not immoral. In other words, a criteria for a moral act determines something is not immoral.
But how would this algorithm we're getting, how would it relate to an algorithm for what actions are criminal? Because that's what I'm really trying to get down to, like the algorithm for determining which actions are criminal, i.e. which actions it would be just to prohibit.
Well, I mean, you just used two sets of terms. I'm going to give you the science. That's what I'm giving you. Now, I said that there was criminal, which was direct, ethical, and immoral. Now, those terms have meaning in law. They have specific meanings. All right. Generally speaking, something that's criminal is always enforced. Something that's ethical is sometimes enforced, and something It's moral is usually normatively enforced. So that is a fact.
Okay, right.
So
So let's.
your definition has to match,
Okay,
has
right.
to
Let's
be
let
able to tolerate
if
the fact.
we can cut through all of this. If I just ask, what are the set of prohibitive actions, we could call them, i.e., actions where it would be just to prevent them from going forth. It'd be just to prohibit them.
Anything it's a via negativa logic. Maybe you don't know that. A via negativa statement. It's anything that that violates the criteria for moral action.
So
I don't know why is that
it's
hard.
any actions which you're allowed to prohibit, it violates the criteria for
No,
more
no,
action.
I'm saying there's a scientific test of what's immoral. Of the immoral, the subset of immoral.
I'm looking for specifically the set of actions which you are just in prohibiting.
You're just in prohibiting anything that violates the criteria of morality.
Okay, right. So what are those criteria?
Productive, fully informed,
right?
Voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests,
right?
Within the free of imposition of costs against the demonstrated of others by externality, and warranted within the limits of liability and restitutability.
So a prohibitive action violates at least one of the criteria where the action has to be productive, fully informed, it has to be a voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests, has to be free of imposition of costs against the demonstrated others by externality, and it has to be or warranted within the limits of liability and restitutability.
Correct. That is the full scope of the properties necessary to adjudicate all differences. In other words, that's the underlying general rule. In other words, humans won't retaliate. Humans won't retaliate. Doesn't mean they won't aggress, but they won't retaliate. And they will preserve cooperation if those terms are met. In other words, there's no incentive to retaliate.
Okay, can I just go to the toilet real quick and then we'll dig into these criteria? Sure. Alright, cool. I'll see you in a second. No clue what the fuck that meant. Alright, I'm back. So, you're allowed to prohibit non-productive actions. Let's start there. Are you there, by the way?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
And yes, these it takes some understanding of what these terms means. But go ahead.
yeah. So a non-productive action would me sitting at home on the couch just watching TV. Would that be a non-productive action?
Oh, it doesn't involve an exchange, right?
So would somebody be allowed to prohibit me from sitting at home on the couch then?
Doesn't involve an exchange. What demonstrated interest are you transferring? You're not.
Um,
You're not taking from it. You're not imposing a cost on anyone's demonstrated interest, are you?
I
No.
mean, so the criteria were right. Just make sure I've structured my criteria correctly. The set of moral actions, i.e., actions which you couldn't prohibit, would be those which are 1, productive. That's the first criteria. 2, fully informed. 3, voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests. 4, free of imposition of costs against the demonstrated others by externality. And 5, warranted within the limits of liability and restitutability. Have I structured those correctly?
Well, it's a sentence, right? So you have the subject, which is voluntary transfer of demonstrated interest, and then you have the qualifiers, which are that transfer has to be productive, fully informed, warranted, and voluntary, and then on the backside it needs to be free of imposition of costs on others. In other words, you can't put a cost on others' demonstrated interest,
Well,
and you have to be able to, if you've said something, you've made some claim, you have to be able to warranty it and be liable for it within the limits of restitution. So it's just a sentence. So knowing the subject, the first thing you test is did something transfer here?
I mean, like, what I'm trying to get at is just the criteria set, which
I to you, and I just explained to you. The first thing, if you ask me, is the set there? I gave it to you in sentence order because that's the grammatically correct means of sentence. If you want to run tests in particular order, the test would begin with whether it was a transfer of demonstrated interest pursued. The second thing you'd want to know if it was voluntary. The third thing you'd want to know is if it was productive. Last is you want to know is fully informed, and the rest of it's pretty easy. Is it hurting anybody else? Is it can you warranty that you're telling the truth? Is it possible to warranty it? Is it possible to be liable for it? In other words, can you perform restitution for it if you're dishonest? So anything that fits those criteria it's pretty hard to be anything other than a virtuous person in that particular action.
so it's like it's like a tuple, right? It's ordered. So I start at the first criteria, then move on to the other ones.
You can order it. You can order it that way, but it does. It's just a checklist.
But I mean, if it is just a checklist, then my question of having productive as a element of this criteria set, that would stand. Are we seeing whether this action is productive? It's not, then it's prohibitive.
Are you trying to make stuff up? I mean, I can't. I'm trying to figure out if you're being intellectually. I'm assuming you're being.
I'm trying to translate your big sentence into a set of criteria.
It's a set of criteria, as stated. What
Okay,
you're asking
right.
is, does it matter what order you test them?
Yeah. If you were to violate any single one of those criteria,
and I told you the order to test them in.
Okay, right, yeah. So, but initially you didn't make them out as if they were ordered. You gave me productive first, but then when you gave me the ordinal, you gave me productive later.
That's a sentence structure that is the most parsimonious possible. So okay. I don't have to make it even longer.
So
it's grammatically correct, but it's dependent upon the user understanding it.
Right. So in the ordered tuple of these criteria, first it has to be a transfer of demonstrated interest. Is that correct? Is it correct that is the first one?
Why do you think order matter? It really doesn't.
Well, if it doesn't matter, then we are back to the example of me sitting on the couch. That's not productive.
Well,
so we violated at least one of the criteria.
Why do you have to do that? It doesn't. I'm hard to figure out whether it doesn't make sense. That makes any sense. It could be any one of those things fails. You just check all of them. Now,
so
the answer
yeah,
is
then how are we? What is the algorithm? How am I applying this set to any given action to determine whether it is criminal or not?
Just do it the way I told you. Then let's play it that game. If you think it's that hard, you can't sort these automatic yourself. That's fine. Let's just do it by the order I gave you then, which is to start with whether it's. Let's start with whether it's.
Well, you started with productive.
No, I said if you want it in order you want to go through it, I would say the simplest test is was there a transfer of demonstrated interest?
Okay. And then if it's voluntary after that.
I really can't figure out if you're intellectually honest at this point, and I hope you're not wasting my time.
I'm trying to translate your word salad into understandable terms.
I really don't think you are. I think you're being dishonest, but I'm going to try it one more time. It doesn't make any difference if you have a checklist. You're just trying to see if the checklist.
Well, we need some sort of algorithm.
No, you don't. No, you don't.
We do, or else I can't attack it. Because
every single day.
If you just spit out an entire treatise in response to every question, then how on earth am I supposed to respond?
Try to lie or not? I don't know.
How am I supposed to respond to you if you respond with a treatise to every single question I have? How am I supposed to respond to that? How am I supposed to dissect that?
You're supposed to respond to the fact that it's a lot of work to educate you on a subject you obviously don't know about and admitted you don't know about. I
know plenty about natural law. I don't think you do.
Sorry?
I said I know plenty about natural law.
You don't know. You don't. You can't.
Yeah. And I can give you Rothbard. I can give you Rothbard for you to attack. I can do that. Can you give me Doolittle's natural law for me to attack? Can you do that? Seems you can't.
Oh, of course I can. You want me to tear Rothbard apart? I can do it all day long. But I want to make sure that I don't let you get away with the little lie.
Doolittle's natural law.
I don't want to get away with the lie.
Give me Doolittle's natural law, the criteria set, the algorithm I can use to attack any given action and determine whether it is a crime.
And you can't falsify it by attempting to say that you need an order to a checklist.
You said there needs to be an order. I was going, okay, well, I guess it has to be in order then.
You said there has to be ordered.
Fucking hell. I started out with it being an unordered set, a set rather than a tuple, and you said, well, it doesn't matter if productive, because, it has to be a transfer of demonstrated interest. And I was like, okay, so I guess there's an order to this then.
No,
what is the algorithm that you are applying to blackmail to determine that it is a crime?
Trust every criteria of the checklist to determine if it's immoral. If it's immoral, the group may or may not determine to outlaw it as a crime. You may turn out to
so if it's a checklist then, productive is not checked for me sitting at home on the couch. Productive isn't checked off there. So therefore, is that a criminal action for me to sit at home and be unproductive?
Voluntary transfer happening.
It's a checklist. You say there's a checklist. There may or may not be a voluntary transfer, so that might also not be checked off. So is this an immoral action?
There can't be a question of productivity if no transfers happen.
So then it is ordered. So you have to have transfers at the top.
Well, I mean, like I said, it's in sentence order. And then I told you, if you want to do it in execution order, I would start with that's exactly what I said to you, and you're making me repeat it.
Okay, so transfer of demonstrated interest first, then voluntary, then productive, then informed, then after that, was it warranted within the limits of liability and restitutability?
Externality, whether it imposes costs by externality.
Okay, so it's the externality one next. So it's free of imposition of costs after, voluntary. Let's get this down here. So it has to be a transfer of demonstrated interest, then it has to be a voluntary transfer of demonstrated interests, then free of imposition of costs against demonstrated others by externality, and then it has to be productive. Is that the entire algorithm?
That's not what I just told you. I don't know how you got there, but that'll work. I said that you would go through, and the first thing would be, is it a transfer? Was it voluntary? Was it fully informed? Was it productive? Was it externality? Those things are equal tests. It doesn't make any difference. Then once you say is now, is it impose a cost by externality?
I mean, I'm trying to reorder what you gave me initially.
It doesn't make any difference. You have to
It very much
answer all
does
the
make a
questions.
difference, though. Okay, so
No, it doesn't have to make a difference.
it has to be
The answer is you have to ask all the questions. That's
right.
all.
Okay, so it has to be a transfer of demonstrated interest. It has to be voluntary. It has to be productive. What was after productive?
Fully informed.
Fully informed. Okay. Was there anything after that?
What do you see missing from the list?
So I've got transfer of demonstrated interest. Is it externality after fully informed? Because I don't see externality on the ordered list.
I can't. Again, as far as I can tell, you're just.
Oh my god, I'm trying to get to this in algorithmic form.
I'm just going to assume you're intellectually dishonest, and let's move on to Rothbard.
I'm going to assume you don't know what an algorithm means.
Let's go back over to Rothbard.
Do you know what I mean by asking you to get this into an algorithm?
Where you think that there has to be a machine executable algorithm rather than a checklist
when I say algorithm? What do you think a checklist is?
That's just a lie by construction.
What do you think a checklist is?
If you want to be a child, that's fine.
You are doing an algorithm when you're taking off a checklist.
Rothbard.
I really don't think you know what I mean by algorithm here.
An algorithm is a machine processable algorithm. If you mean a procedure or a process can be executed by a human being using rational decisions, a sequence, and that order isn't necessary because it's not sequential. It can be iterative. The person can go over the checklist 10 times. It doesn't have to be
sequential if it's an algorithm.
And qualify each item as they are fit. They don't need to have it. It might be that there's no question of externality. It might be there's no question of fully informed. It might be that there's no question of need for warranty. Any of those things can happen. So it doesn't make any difference. You iteratively cross the list until all the questions are answered, and whether they violate the topic or not. That's what courts do every day. That's how
right. So is it that if a single one of the criteria is violated,
it's how adults make decisions, it's how corporate decisions are made, it's how economic decisions are made, it's how financial decisions are made.
So if a single,
that's it. That's period. End of story. And everything else you pull out of your ass is bullshit.
If a single criteria is violated, is it prohibitive then? If a single criteria is violated, is it prohibitive?
Violated. A single criteria is violated. As far as I know, it will be there. Yes. The question is not all criteria are obvious at first blush. In other words, not all violations will be customable. And the second thing, it may not apply. There may be no externalities.
Okay, so then we need a higher level criteria set to see whether this criteria set even applies to the action. But I'm looking for the meta set.
You don't know that, and that's not true.
I'm looking for the meta set which should apply to any given action to tell me whether it's a
cat must
crime.
be of certain size with 4 legs, a tail, this shape, and whatever. That's what makes a cat. Period. It's a checklist. If you can't do that, then you aren't competent to actually hold this discussion.
So if it doesn't fit those criteria, then it's not a cat. That's what I'm looking for crime.
That's what I just gave you. That's what that
you didn't, though, because I gave you an action which wasn't productive, and you said, well, no, it doesn't apply to that action. No, I'm looking for it to apply to any given action. Any action.
Go ahead. I just discounted it originally. It failed the criteria for demonstrated interest. It's not an immoral act. It's at best an immoral act.
So it doesn't, but then it violates just multiple criteria.
No, it doesn't violate anything.
Well, it's non-productive and it's not a transfer.
You can't have the absence of involuntary transfer and have anything to do with a productive, fully informed warranty. This is just absolutely ridiculous. It's an asinine statement. It's impossible to have that.
Okay,
so
it's not a transfer, so it violates that criteria.
Understanding of what I'm saying, if you can't understand something that's simple.
If it violates, it's not a transfer, so it violates that criterion. It's not productive, so it violates that criterion. So it violates multiple criteria.
It doesn't violate a single criteria. It doesn't cause
how does it not violate
an involuntary transfer.
So it needs to cause an involuntary transfer now.
Again, you're not able to do this. I can't. I'm going to go with your. I can't figure out if you're stupid or intellectually dishonest. But this is a waste of my time. All right, I had a suspicion it would be a waste of my time because most of you people are.
Yeah. Okay.
But
I mean, if you
do it.
can't handle
if I
a
have,
simple question like this,
I have at least 300 people who know it to understand this and do it every day and become better at it. Now,
okay,
if you can't handle the simple question of
projection, I just said that.
a test of morality.
You just instantly
Does sitting
incorporated it.
Does sitting on the couch cause a transfer? No, then it can't be an involuntary transfer. If that logic is beyond you,
right?
then
okay, so it has to be
logic
an
is beyond you.
involuntary transfer, and then it's prohibitive. Because you didn't
Sorry?
say that. You didn't say it has to be an involuntary transfer. Then it's an action that you're allowed to prohibit.
What is this list of criteria of?
I'm looking to get the list of criteria, but every time
So
I push
gave
you
a
on
list
it,
of
you
criteria,
change it.
and I gave you what it was, and you
right,
can't
and then
hold it to
when
that.
I give you an action which violates one of the criteria, you say at least one of the criteria. You say, well, no, it doesn't apply to that action. Well,
Right,
then
but
give me
you didn't violate it.
give me a set
Then
of criteria which applies to any given action.
Any given action, does it cause a transfer?
Literally any action. I want just a set of criteria which would apply to literally any action I could throw your way.
There are no actions that it doesn't apply to. Does it cause?
Does this apply to me sitting on the couch then?
It doesn't cause a transfer.
Does
No other
this
person affected by
criteria
your
set
action.
apply to me sitting on the couch? Could it determine whether that is criminal?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
There is no
It
transfer.
violates.
Therefore,
It is not productive
it's
though.
It's not possible.
It's not productive though.
But it
One of
doesn't-
your
it
criteria
doesn't matter because
was
it
that
has
it's
to be an
productive.
unproductive.
It has to be productive.
Transfer. How can you not get this? It can't. The question is,
So
how
it's,
can
it's
it
not
be
that
an
it has to be
unproductive
productive.
transfer?
It has to be a productive transfer. Okay.
Right. This is a
But
sentence.
this
remember?
also isn't a
Hold on, hold
productive
on. Let's try
transfer.
to get this through.
This isn't a productive
Again,
transfer
I
either.
don't want to waste any more of your time by my time by trying to make sure if you're intellectually done. I need to know if you're even smart enough to understand this.
Right, this
It's
is
a sentence.
me sitting on the
Answer
couch
the question.
isn't me being
It's a
isn't
sentence.
isn't
It's a
an
sentence.
isn't a
It has
voluntary
set of
transfer.
criteria. Are you capable of understanding that? It's a sentence.
I'm perfectly capable of
It has
understanding
a
many
set of
things.
criteria. It describes a condition. Can you comprehend that? Just say yes
Yes.
or no. You can comprehend it.
Yes.
Okay. So what's the subject of the sentence?
The subject of the sentence. Say it.
A transfer. That's the event that
Yes.
happened. That's the subject.
Okay.
What are the criteria for the transfer?
So it has to be a transfer. It has to be voluntary, productive, fully informed, and free of externality.
Within and warranted within the limits of liability.
Warranted, yes.
Those are the
Okay.
Those are the qualifications of the subject.
So
the subject
if
is
it's
transfer.
not that,
There's no
right.
If there's no transfer, there can't be a crime.
okay, so if there is no transfer, there is no crime. If I stab you in the throat, has anything transferred?
Yeah, you've taken my life.
Okay.
You've applied violence.
So it has to be a transfer which satisfies these criteria. Right. Got it. So let's say blackmail. How does this violate these criteria then? There's a transfer going on. We're transferring money. Right? So it is a transfer.
Unproductive.
So what makes it unproductive?
I didn't. You know the general Misesian, right? That if I make an exchange, the rational means by which an exchange is both of us possess more afterwards than before. That's what productive means.
Well, I mean,
we have increased our demonstrated interest by doing so. Is the general rule.
I mean, I feel like they both would have more afterwards because the person who's being blackmailed, they're now secure in the information that the information won't be released, right? So they're now higher on their value scale.
So what's the test? We've rationalized that. The test is whether their interpretation is whether it's a voluntary transfer, and it's not, because people react with retaliation to bribery like they react.
But sometimes they don't act with retaliation.
Well, we sometimes don't prosecute all sorts of crimes.
But if they don't act with retaliation, then did they see it as voluntary?
No, they just don't want to pay the cost of
Oh,
retaliation.
but you said the reason why they didn't see it as voluntary is because they retaliate.
I can want to retaliate, and I can choose not to do it.
But then how do you know that it's involuntary?
I really can't get why this is so hard for you.
No, because you said the reason why it's involuntary is by demonstrated preference, i.e. they demonstrate that they think it's involuntary by retaliating. But what if they don't retaliate?
That's your observable, right? What's their observable?
I don't know what you mean by that.
Retaliate.
So they want to retaliate,
but they choose not to.
Okay, what if they don't want to retaliate?
Well, if they don't want to retaliate, why?
I don't know, maybe they have a fucking fetish for being blackmailed.
Great, exactly. Well, they don't want to pay them
so is
whatever
this
it
voluntary
is.
then?
But that's not, hold on, that's not a general rule. That's not a law.
All I'm looking for is a counterexample to
there is no
blackmail being criminal.
There isn't a counterexample to what I've said.
This is a counterexample wherein the person doesn't retaliate and they don't want to retaliate.
You asked whether the person has. You asked the question of criminality. I'm telling you, it violates the criteria. If the person chooses not to prosecute it for whatever reason, that doesn't matter. That's an outlier case. In the majority, people do, and that's the purpose of law, is a general rule.
But you're saying the reason it violates the criteria is because the person thinks that it's involuntary. i.e. the blackmailed thinks it's involuntary. But the reason why you're saying the blackmailed thinks it's involuntary is because they retaliate against it. But if they don't retaliate against it, and they don't want to retaliate against it...
chose not to. I can like a vanilla ice cream, but not pay for it. In other words, I'm going to decide not to pay for it. That's all that's happening. Why is that so hard for you to grasp?
I don't see the relevance of this analogy.
No, that is the whole point. It's the observer, the objective observer, and the general rule are you observe in the process of developing a general rule, which we call a law, which we use outlaw a crime, is something that's observable. In the individual case, there's noise and signal. The individual, for whatever reason, decided he doesn't want to go do it. But that doesn't have anything to do with the fact that in the case of if it does come up to a decision...
The reason why it wasn't voluntary is because they do retaliate.
Interrupting me. It told you the case. It doesn't affect
That's what you told me.
That if you go to you take it to the court will decide it because that's the general rule, and the general rule is reducible to the terms I gave you.
How did they get to this general rule?
End of story. Why can't you follow the logic?
Because you're not giving me logic. You're just saying
logic. Why can't you
you're just
follow
decreeing
the
this
between a general rule that the population evolves to solve a general scope of problems and an
are you saying they
outlier
necessarily
case
have to evolve
that the
in such?
individual doesn't want to prosecute? It doesn't mean it doesn't fit the rule. It doesn't mean that people don't outlier.
You said
it just means
the reason why it's involuntary is because they retaliate.
Why is that hard for you?
You said that.
Why can't you even comprehend
You said the
that?
reason why it's involuntary is because the blackmailed wants to retaliate. You said that's why blackmail is involuntary. But there could be a case where the blackmailed doesn't want to retaliate. Why don't you understand what I'm saying?
People under
Why don't you understand what I'm saying right now?
A law is a general rule for the resolution of disputes between people.
In what sense is it general if it doesn't apply generally?
Then they just don't.
There is a counterexample in front of you.
Comprehend the
why don't you attack this counterexample?
There is no counterexample.
I just gave you a counterexample.
An outlier
That's
case
what a counterexample is.
Rule. That's all that you said.
That's what it means to have a counterexample.
It's not a counterexample. It's not
a counterexample. You would have to be able it's an example to the counter.
You would have to invalidate the general rule, and which is the purpose of decidability in a group is a general rule. What you've just said is somebody chooses not, for some weird reason, not to consider blackmail offensive and not to retaliate against it.
So that would make it not a general rule.
It's not a question of morality or law now, because nobody wants to retaliate or cause a resolution of a dispute. That's all.
Then are we at, if the majority of society wants to criminalize something, then it's criminal? Is that where we're at?
Well, you again conflated the difference between moral and criminal. People make up shit all the time. That doesn't mean we can't tell whether the law they've made up is moral or immoral. In other words, it's a just law or not. We absolutely can. It just means that they either make mistakes or they have bad incentives or whatever. So people can make laws. But we can objectively determine whether that your guy engaged in blackmail, and that we can objectively determine that there's a general rule people retaliate on blackmail. We can objectively determine by the resolution of
Whoa.
thousands and thousands of disputes
We can
over
objectively
centuries
determine
that black people prohibit
that there's a general rule that people retaliate.
blackmail, and we can determine that some people don't enforce it. These are normal. This is just a fact.
I'm sorry, there's objectively determined that there's a general rule that people retaliate. How did you objectively derive that there's a general rule?
The empirical evidence of the resolution of disputes.
That's not objectively determining it. You're looking at what has happened in history.
That's absolutely objective.
That doesn't demonstrate a general rule. That demonstrates a historical happenstance, not a general rule.
Only if and which the underlying general rule isn't common across cultures. That common cause is what causes falsification. I think maybe your problem may be you don't understand the difference between justification, the end of justificationism, and science and the rise of falsification. I think you may not grasp that justification doesn't exist.
Let's imagine a society where, in general, people think it's fine to enslave blacks, and if a black leaves your plantation, then you're allowed to lynch them. And let's imagine this society lasted 10,000 millennia. It's just a really long-lasting society where in 90-odd% of cases where a black leaves the plantation, they lynch them, right?
You're acting like that's a hard question.
Yeah, so what would happen here? You would look back on history and you'd say, well, the general rule has been that it's fine to enslave blacks. Would this make the natural law that it's fine to enslave blacks?
So, the natural law, of course, is just reciprocity with the limits of proportionality, just like I said. That's what the evidence is. Now, the part you're escaping is you're trying to make a theological or ideal out of it, which is an unscientific statement. And you're trying to do that in order to say that overcome the fact that it's a rational choice whether to cooperate or not. If it's a non-rational choice to cooperate, there are no moral questions. There are no moral questions in war. There's only practical
in the society of slavers, would it be just to enslave people?
Would it be just people you mean, which just are you using? You mean legal, or are you trying to make some
natural
morality
law
up?
Well, I mean, the law is embedded in ethics. For something to be just, it means you ought to not break it.
Okay, you're just pulling words out of your ass. Let's try it.
I'm not. I'm looking at the SEP here.
No, you're not.
We can bring up the SEP if you want.
So let's go back with here's the answer. Why did everybody enslaved everybody for a long time? And this happened because of agrarianism. The end of slavery happened because of the end of agrarianism. In other words, the rise of trade. It turned out to be not valuable to have expensive slaves, because a slave turns out to be about the cost of a car compared to what you and I have today. So they're too freaking expensive. So that's why the war over slavery was rather ridiculous, because slaves would have been unaffordable within 30 years. That said, so are you cooperating with these people who are slaves? No, you're not. So ethics is a question. Morality is a question for those people who you want to cooperate with. It's not a question for those you don't want to cooperate with. The natural law of cooperation applies to those you would cooperate with. And so that's it. There's nothing more complicated. That's why we murder each other in war, and we try not to murder each other outside of it. So because ethics is only a question of cooperation, and the natural law is the natural law of cooperation. If there's no cooperation, there's no law. Natural law.
Right. So, this slave society, yes or no, would it be illegal to enslave people?
In their society, have they made it illegal?
Well, in the society, I don't think people can make things illegal. In the society, they are continuing along enslaving people and lynching escaped slaves. They're going along like that for millennia. So are they engaged in crime?
They have decided they don't want to cooperate with these people called slaves, right?
Right.
Well, then that's their choice.
Does this sound like a natural law to you, or a law determined by these guys? They've determined that they want to make it legal to have slaves.
Well,
Or did they find out? Did they find out that it was legal to have slaves? And if they find it out, then why didn't it apply to us? Because we have the same nature. They're all men.
So you're just making that up from Christian religious nonsense. So the answer is that
I'm not a Christian, bro.
Well, whatever. That's where it comes from. So the underlying question is: do you want to cooperate with them?
Well,
no.
They don't. You never want to cooperate with somebody if you're engaging in crime with them. That's the point.
Well, of course it's not. Now, the other question is: in your society, have you chosen to cooperate with whatever group you're enslaving? No, you've chosen to enslave them. So I mean,
right. Then we need to determine whether this is criminal, and it is criminal.
No, it isn't criminal because crime is a political choice. Natural law is a question of cooperation, and outside of those two questions, there's no such thing as moral or ethical or criminal.
I mean,
it can't be.
The law is definitely embedded in ethics, right?
What?
The law is embedded in ethics.
No, the ethics.
Oh, it is. I mean, we can go to the SEP here, the page on justice. The idea of justice occupies center stage in both ethics and legal and political philosophy.
Try to falsify my statement. If I am in a world of natural world of man against man, there is no such thing as ethics or morality or crime outside of those who I wish to cooperate with.
Well, that is
everyone
false.
Else is prey.
There is such a thing as ethics and law.
Where?
In logic.
Why is it logical for me to go to whatever ethics you're making up? Ethics isn't logical.
You objectively ought to do it.
Ethics is logic. Logic in ethics is merely a post hoc justification of that which we discovered that works. That's what the logic is. That's what all logic is.
You can determine it a priori, not after the case.
You can't. There is no a priori.
There is a priori.
How I ate Hoppe and Kant for lunch. What a priori?
A priori.
I gave you the logical sequence of the evolution of ethics, which
was completely irrelevant to what ethics is.
Suicide, defeating and killing and conquering. I gave you the origin, the evolution of that. That's
the evolution of ethics is irrelevant. It's completely irrelevant.
No. Then what is define ethics?
Ethics is, I suppose you could say, it's how to live a good life. It's what you ought to do, we could say.
Under what conditions?
Under the conditions of life. What ought you do?
You live in a bunch of hunter-gatherers, and they're really good with stone axes, and they make their living by killing and conquering neighboring males, taking their women and livestock. That's living a good life.
It's not a good life. They ought not do that.
How do you know that?
They ought not do that. I know that because I know ethics.
Well, you think you know that because you've made it up.
I didn't make it up. Because
there's no evidence.
We have negative demonstration
existing in history.
We have negative demonstration. You know, Aristotle here. Negative demonstration. If you try to propose the counter, ruh-roh, you're in contradiction. So you're wrong.
I'm rarely. I make mistakes like everyone, but error very infrequently. So let's go back to this. You can't define ethics operationally. You can't give a causal explanation of ethics.
What do you mean an explanation of ethics?
It's a feeling. You have it as a feeling.
What do you mean an explanation? Can you give a causal explanation of the law of non-contradiction? What the fuck does that mean?
It's really easy. Why? I mean, I can talk about it at the neurological level.
Yeah, give me a causal explanation of the law of non-contradiction.
Sure, I can.
What do you mean to do that?
What?
What does it mean to do that? To give a causal explanation. What caused the law of non-contradiction?
In an attempt to identify consistent relations between two states.
So we created the law of non-contradiction, did we?
It's just, simple neurology.
So we created the law of non-contradiction, did we?
No, we discovered it.
Yeah, we discovered it. So we didn't cause it then.
We didn't create it.
So you're not giving an example of the cause of it.
I'm going to explain to you a horrifying falsification of most philosophy. What is the liar's paradox a contradiction, or is it a failure of logic?
Give me the liar's paradox. I'm not familiar with that one.
Everything written inside this box is a lie.
So you've got a box. Everything written inside it is a lie. I mean, elaborate. Why would that be some sort of horrible?
It's a contradiction, right? But it's not.
Okay.
It's a grammatical error, because the existence
Okay.
of grammar, all grammar,
Why would it be
is the continuous recursive disambiguation.
What-
So it violates.
I
the
could-
principle of.
Well, I could go into the corner of my room, get a box, write A equals not A, throw that in the box, close up the box, and I could genuinely say everything written inside this box is a lie.
No, you're confusing the box with the text. Everything in this sentence is a lie. How about that? It's just the point is it's a verbalism.
Well, yeah, it's some sort of paradox, right?
It's not, though. It's just a grammatical failure. So if I had a mathematical expression that was incomplete, it would allow me to make incomplete judgments from it. Well, that's the problem with a lot of these sophistries, and most sophistries, is that they rely on a violation of the demand for continuous recursive disambiguation, which is all that language consists of. It means the law of universal grammar is continuous recursive disambiguation. So it's just a violation of the grammar that takes advantage of our human suggestibility. In other words, why we're stupid, which is, again, why non-aggression works, because we're stupid and suggestible. We insert whatever we believe is not the limit to non-aggression in there, and then we say we agree with it. But if we take 1,000 people, put them together, they all come up with different things they consider what's the limits of aggression, non-aggression. So anyway, I forgot where we were. I forgot where we were. I've lost it.
So we were at blackmail. Blackmail, is it a crime? Then we were into, okay, then ethics is embedded in law.
I was asking you to define what ethics is from first principles, and I was saying you can't do it, and I know you can't.
Well, ethics is what you ought to do.
Ethics is what you ought to do when and where and why.
Anywhere.
Okay.
What you ought to do.
How do you handle let's go back to using marginal cases. We're in the desert, and we have a glass of water, the diamond water paradox. We have a glass of water. There's only enough water for one of us to make it. But one of us to make it out of the desert and live.
Mm-hmm.
What's the ethical decision?
Who owns the water?
Okay, that's one of the decisions.
Is no,
that?
Who owns it? Like, who homesteaded it? What was the chain of title transfers? I.e., who is the current just owner? That's my question.
Why wouldn't I just kill you and take the water because my life depends on it?
Well, you shouldn't, because that'd be a crime.
It doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean anything. I'm going to do it anyway.
Okay, but then you'll be a criminal.
That's what people do. So the question is, yes, but who's going to enforce that crime?
Irrelevant to whether it's a crime.
Well, I mean, does anyone know what existed?
It's irrelevant to whether or not you have engaged in a crime.
Correct, but it doesn't matter, right? Because I'm alive, and nobody knows about it, and there's no way to enforce it.
It is relevant though, because you are a criminal now. You've done something you shouldn't have done.
A criminal requires awareness of it.
You were plenty. Oh, you had mens rea. You were plenty aware that you stabbed me to death.
All you can say is I acted immorally.
You are immorally, meaning you ought not do it. So we agree. You ought not have done it.
But I ought to have done it because my life takes priority.
You said it was immoral.
Well, I mean,
you just said you acted immorally, meaning you ought not do it. So you have a contradiction in your ethics.
The point I want to make here.
So you have to be wrong.
The point I want to make here is that all of these questions have limits. Just as suicide, just as killing you and taking your stuff, just as killing you and yours and taking you and your stuff, which is the limit of these decisions is only that which is cooperation. So ethics is ethical rules are a general rule for the
They are a
majority of
universal rule.
situations, independent of outliers. Now the question is, people are going to act unethically. This is true in any given condition. Is it the problem we're going to get to is that that's the whole point. Is that what we are talking about is ethics and morals and whatever are general rules that are useful for preservation of well-being and well-being within a cooperative order. If there's no cooperative order and we're not cooperating, it's not a question of ethics. It's a question of survival. So what we call this is graceful failure, another fallback, and graceful accumulation, graceful success. So what we, of course, we want is you want everybody to gradually move toward natural law, which is the rules I've given you. And it appears that by and large, as civilizations become wealthy enough, they tend to do that. It certainly appears that international law has tended to do that because it's simply safer, not because I want to be a good person, because that's just a bunch of stuff for self-motivation, but because
Right,
it's the
which
only
is
thing we can
what
do.
natural law is. It's about motivation, i.e. the reasons for acting.
Well, again, a scientific law explains why. Reasons are just obvious, which is self-interest.
Well,
Right?
this is
Ethics,
this. We go back to the set.
ethical behavior
Natural
is
law is all
just
about
under most
why you ought
circumstances
to
in
act
your
in some
self-interest.
certain way as
It-
opposed to some other way.
What?
Specifically dealing with disputes, right? So it's all about the reasons for doing certain things. It's about wanting to be a good person, so you want to engage legally.
So I don't know what that has. I don't know what if you're trying to make
So
a
it's
contrary
not.
point.
It
I don't see
is.
it.
You said it's not about wanting to be a good person. It's just about pure pragmatics of, well, what's best for me. It's
Yeah,
well,
but
what's best for you is to be a good fucking person.
that's the physicalist description of the behavioralist experience.
Right, but that's irrelevant. Like that is
No,
relevant in that is
if
relevant in
it's not
praxeology, but
causality
not
is
ethics.
physical. Experience is just that, experiential. So I mean, if you want to feel, you want feels. That's okay. You can explain it by feels. If you want to explain it by reals, you can explain it by reals.
And
Reals are more precise.
ethics is reals.
Feels are more adaptable. I mean, in other words, more ascertainable. But that's all.
Ethics is reals. Really, what ought you do?
I don't know. Any use of the word is in an identitarian in an attempt to identify a thing by analogy is the origin of sophistry. So try to say that without the verb to be. I would say ethics consists of the discipline which we have attempted to codify as general rules, those things which will allow us to live in least conflict and greatest return in social and political orders.
I guess I found the root of your
And
word
then if I were to
salivitis.
say how do we decide what's ethical? Ethical and moral. I would
If
say
that's your
natural law.
if that's your restatement of ethics is about, then Jesus Christ, no wonder it takes so long to get through a conversation with you.
It takes a long time because and it's one of the problems with our work is that we prohibit sophistry and deceit by conflation. And so we require you to speak in measurements, not analogies. And so in doing so, we prohibit the sophistries that emerge from you using analogies.
I'm
So
not
this
using
is
an
the
analogy
difference
when I
between
say
science and
ethics
philosophy.
is about something or another. I'm not using an analogy there.
Yeah, you are.
How am I using an analogy?
What is it? Define what is means.
I think we both know what is,
You
right?
can't define it. Is means exists as.
Define what define means.
It exists as. What it means is I perceive these properties.
No.
Are
It just means what it is. It's equation.
Or are they just analogous?
It's equation. It's
Is it
equals.
Identity or is it analogy?
Real quick, can you define what define means for me?
Deception by prohibit deception by prohibiting all the analogies. Now, the analogy you try to use is called idealism, which is non-causal, and in other words, it's essentially a circular logic. That's okay because for simple people, that's okay. For even simpler people, religion's okay. But if you have to adjudicate stuff in a court of law with adults who are actually smart, you have to have a scientific explanation for it. And we call it scientific because that's where science comes from. We didn't develop the science for our over faster than every other civilization combined for no reason. We did it because our law is empirical. It's purely empirical. It's
Well,
absent authority.
does science
And so
have to
that
be
means that
empirical?
science is an outgrowth of our law.
Does science have to be empirical?
Well, empirical means observable. It means that's a shortcut for saying it isn't. It adheres to realism and naturalism, realism, naturalism, operationalism, and incentives. I could go through those. I could go through that stack too. But given your difficulty with morality, I think truth would be too much for you. It would be way too much for you.
Yeah, I suppose your explanations might fail there, eh?
They don't fail. I mean, it's
they do though.
concrete work in philosophy, in truth that's ever happened, which is why I have unfortunately, it's why it takes 140 IQ people 6 months just to get going with it. It's just too hard. But anyway,
you are a copy pasta.
Calculus is hard.
You're like if they took the Mensa copy pasta, turned it into a human, and then just threw him out into the world.
You can find anybody who writes anything like I do on Earth. Good luck, it won't happen. But anyway, let's go. Let's see if we can solve it.
That is also the case of schizophrenics who write on walls with piles of shit. Nobody writes like them.
Couple issues.
That doesn't mean they're right.
I explained first what I was trying to do. Then we went over and I said, okay, you can't understand it. Let's go to Rothbard. You evaded Rothbard. You confused.
Okay, let's see your attack of Rothbard there. If you really want to attack Rothbard,
now you've tried to create the circular logic that ethics is something that's just feels. I don't know what to do with this other than say, it's been 2 hours of demonstrating what's wrong with libertarianism. But if you want to try something else, I'll keep at it.
I mean, you can attack Rothbard all you want if you want.
I'll win, of course, because I've defeated Rothbard multiple times. It's not
okay.
Hard.
Go ahead.
Whether you can understand it, try it. Just try me on anything.
Okay, go ahead. The NEP.
The difference between Rothbard, me, and Hoppe. Rothbard's a product of the Ashkenazi Jewish ethics of the Pale, and their
Ashkenazi Jewish ethics of the Pale
is a product of his wish to return to the
what does it mean to have Ashkenazi Jewish ethics of the Pale?
Anglo. So I mean that's just all it is. These are ethics, ethical differences and argumentative differences that have to do with our priors. It's nothing else.
So Rothbard is wrong because he is an ethics Jew of the Pale.
Oh, that's where he gets his ethics from.
Right. So what makes that wrong?
He's wrong because it's really obvious. Separatist ethics, which is libertarianism, can't succeed. It never has succeeded. It can't succeed for the reasons I've stated. You can't produce the incentives necessary to produce a polity that produces sufficient commons to compete.
Why does it matter whether you can create the incentives necessary to go along with ethics as to whether that is the correct ethics? Why does that matter?
Sorry?
Why does it matter whether you can create the incentives to adhere to ethics? Why does that pertain to whether those are the correct ethics?
Oh, that's the first time someone's actually gotten to the point relatively too quickly. All right. So the question is if your ethics mean you're exterminated, are they true? Are they ethical?
What do you mean by exterminated? Exterminated on logical grounds, or simply the people who adhere to them died?
If your applied ethics obviously fail every single time.
Well, how can you know that they fail every single time, rather than just the times that have been observed?
The only time Rothbardian ethics are the ethics of separatism, or an attempt to avoid payment for the commons by which the property is constructed. So really what it is, think of it this way, is that Jewish ethics had a class response somewhat like we did. The Marxists made a lower class ethics, Rothbard made a middle class ethics, and the neocons made a ruling class ethics, but they're all attempts to do the same thing, which is not pay for.
Do you think that Rothbardian ethics have previously failed?
I think that all similar ethical systems have failed, and he has made no contribution sufficient.
So you don't know that his ethical system hasn't previously failed.
Well,
okay. So how do you know that it will fail?
Wait a minute. I got to think about whether this is just another. We haven't tried it yet, and it is. So yes, Marxism can't succeed because we haven't really done Marxism yet.
Okay.
Libertarianism can't succeed because
so
we haven't really tried.
But you are saying that ethical defeat is in actually trying it. You are the empiricist here who says, well, we need to actually go out and try these things before we know if they're invalid or not. I'm the one who says we can know before the fact whether they're invalid. So you can't use that argument on me.
Why did the ethics of the pale fail?
I don't fucking know. Are the ethics of the pale literally Rothbard's ethics? If they aren't, you, Mr. Empiricist, have to go out and test Rothbard's ethics. I don't.
I can't. Are you saying you can't logically test things? And you can't.
You can logically determine it a priori, but you deny the a priori, Mr. Empiricist.
Try to find something close. What proximity to a libertarian society has ever survived?
I don't have to do any such thing.
What?
I don't have to do any such thing. I'm asking you,
right.
Mr. Empiricist, has Rothbard's ethics ever been tested?
The gypsies have.
So you think the gypsies have implemented Rothbard's ethics before?
Let me just make the point, because it's really obvious. The diasporic Jews have. The gypsies have. The settlers in the Danish colonies have. The American West tried to. And that's what I'm missing. I'm missing one. I'm missing one. Anyway, it's the best I can do off the top of my head. And so what's happened in each of these cases is what happens to the separatist, everybody with separatist ethics. And separatist ethics means evasion of payment for commons. So the separatist ethics has gotten them kicked out of gotten the gypsies kicked out of everywhere. It's gotten the Jews kicked out of everywhere. It survived only long enough for the state to allow people a lot of freedoms because they were able to settle a territory and lay claim to that territory on behalf of the power.
So what does it mean?
So in essence, what you're talking about is an ethics of margins, where the territory is so scarce and the cost of ruling it so rare that it's possible to let people have unethical systems because there's no way of imposing an ethical system. So that's why you've seen every single separatist ethic system fail, and it's why you've seen the ethics of the Middle East, which is what
okay. So let's
regress.
First of all, what does it mean for these systems to have failed, like the Jews and the Gypsies? What does it mean for their Rothbardian systems to have failed?
Well, I mean, they're frequently ostracized and exterminated.
So other people came in and killed them. That's what means for them to have failed.
Because other people correctly judge them immoral.
So how does that imply that in the future it's necessarily the case that people will come in and kill Rothbardians?
Well, you'd have to claim that human behavior would change. So
no. How is it? We don't know that is inherent in human behavior to kill Rothbardians.
I want to demonstrate your right differently. So my argument would be that that natural law ethics will succeed because everybody appears to be driving toward it, and that's because it's simply more utilitarian over time, and so that's what's happening. In the end result, if you end up with a rule of law society that completely suppresses irreciprocity, it would look like Rothbardian ethics, except you couldn't use Jewish ethics, which are low trust ethics. You would be obligated for fully informed warranted, and you wouldn't be able to bait people into hazard and specializes in baiting into hazard and rent seeking.
You didn't answer my question yet. Why is it the fact that because these Rothbardian systems, I'll just give to you that these were Rothbardian systems. Why is it that the fact that they failed in the past by other people invading them, why does that imply that they will fail in the future?
Because it's physically, operationally, and behaviorally impossible for that kind of civilization to survive in competition with others.
Why though?
Because it prohibits it specializes in rents. It incentivizes rent seeking, and it suppresses the production of commons that suppress rent seeking. In other words, why were the Jews? Why did Rothbard put the ethics together he did instead of high trust European ethics? What
Okay, let's
caused the
go through
Jews
those
to be
two things.
prosecuted in history, and what's causing the Jews to still be somewhat prosecuted today?
So let's go
Is
through
the
those two things.
specialization
I don't care
in
why he
invading
made his
into hazards.
ethics. It's
And
irrelevant.
so, what is the problem for any marginal group? Is that the suppression of irreciprocity, all those scams, etc., is intolerable for any polity capable of producing high trust economic velocity. It's just not tolerable. So
Okay.
it's not rationally tolerable, which means humans being rational. It's not physically possible.
So what do you mean by rent seeking? And what about Rothbardian ethics implies that it incentivizes rent seeking?
Rothbardian ethics is based on Jewish ethics, which says we only have to agree. We don't have to supply warranty, fully informed, or liability, or freedom from externality. This is why any libertarian society will eventually develop into what we call piracy, and the local civilizations will always crush it. This is what's always happened. The most libertarian societies are those that are pirates, and this is where European civilization comes from.
What does it mean to rent seek?
Rent seek is obtaining value without participating in production, contributing to production.
Okay, right. So it's with attaining value without participating in production. Right. What if I see you on the bus one day, you're wearing yellow socks, and I really like yellow socks, and this makes me absolutely elated. I go into just a pure frenzy with how happy I am that you are wearing yellow socks. I have attained value without producing anything there. Have I engaged in rent seeking?
Has there been a transfer of demonstrated interest?
I don't fucking know what that means.
No, nothing transferred.
Okay, so have I engaged in rent seeking?
Nope.
I've not engaged in rent seeking, but I have attained value. I have attained value.
You had to retain a turn on capital by extracting from someone else's demonstrated interest without contribution.
Okay, no, you said rent seeking was when you attain value. You said that rent seeking was when you attain value without participating in production. In that example of you on the bus with yellow socks, I attained value from your having yellow socks. I engaged in the consumer's good of looking at your yellow socks, and I didn't participate in any production.
Well, I mean, you didn't participate in any transfer.
Exactly, so I didn't participate in production.
You didn't participate in a it doesn't matter. It doesn't make
okay, then how about you fucking give me every single criterion? Give me all of them.
How did you impose a cost on the guy with yellow socks?
You didn't say anything about imposing costs. You didn't say anything about imposing costs.
On him, right?
You didn't say anything about that.
You didn't impose a cost on him, right?
Okay, you didn't fucking say anything about imposing costs.
You didn't impose a cost on him, right?
You didn't say anything about that. Fucking say everything you want to say. You love fucking talking all day long, but you don't give me everything I need. Just give me the things I need. Don't talk about fucking Jews and gypsies all day. Give me what I need.
You've demonstrated an inability to retain it. That's what you've done.
Fucking hell.
Demonstrated an inability.
What does it mean to rent seek?
Criteria. And demonstrated an inability to apply.
You've demonstrated an inability to be concise.
You demonstrated that ability. Now the question is why you do that. I don't know. You could be mentally ill. You could be intellectually dishonest.
Have you read by any chance George Orwell's essay on why you should be concise and not be a fucking bloviating retard for 2 hours straight?
Unfortunately, if you listen to philosophers or you listen to scientists, it's extremely detailed for the specific reason I'm being specifically detailed, to stop people like you from justifying and lying. So I'm just trying to do the best
and it clearly didn't fucking work, did it?
Available. So let's go back to the question, whatever the hell else you were trying to get to. You did not impose a cost against the other person.
So what does it mean to rent seek?
Since there was no transfer, there can be no rent seeking.
What does it mean to rent seek?
There's no
Give me the whole fucking criteria set. Everything which defines rent seeking. Give me it all. Give me it all.
Why is that so hard for you to get? I mean,
because you didn't fucking tell me about fucking transfers as it pertains to rent seeking. You didn't tell me about any of this. You just assume that I've already read everything you fucking wrote.
If you're gonna talk about matters of this substance, you have a more than a child's understanding.
Oh, I know plenty about natural law. I know more about law than you. In fact,
extremely unlikely. And
it's very likely because I'm correct and you're incorrect.
So let's go back to, I made the statement that you obtained an experiential benefit, but no rent could have occurred because no demonstration.
Then give me the definition of rent seeking.
What?
Give me the definition of rent seeking.
You want the short definition that I gave you originally? You want the long definition?
The criteria set. Just every criterion, boom. One criteria done, written it down, then on to the next one, then on to the next one.
Criteria for rent seeking is any attempt to obtain some portion of returns, in other words, interest, without contributing to the production of common. In other words, some interest must be transferred in order for you to obtain rents. This is an unfortunate word that's been, unfortunately, too embedded in the vernacular of economics because of its ancient origins. But it basically means that you have, the analogy is I would go and bribe some official to give me some portion of the rents from some property going forward. Okay, so that's rent seeking. So I'm extracting without obtaining rent, but it's a general term for any time. It's like corruption, right? From the inside and rent seeking from the outside. So think of it as a mirror image of corruption.
So it's like if you attempt to attain some portion of the returns from something without contributing to the production of commons.
No, the production of whatever it is you're producing, that's being produced.
Okay. So, what does it mean to have a return if not a psychic return, i.e. a psychic profit?
Yeah, there has to be a transfer.
So it has to be so return from transfer.
Mm-hmm. In other words, the return has to somehow include a transfer.
So it's an attempt to attain returns in the form of transfer without contributing to the production of the thing in question.
Simplest term, sure.
Okay. So let's apply this to, I don't know, a hot dog stand. So there's a hot dog vendor selling hot dogs for $5, and I give the hot dog vendor $5. In return, he gives me a hot dog. Now, I receive a profit, I receive a return through the transfer of this hot dog, but I didn't produce the hot dog, right?
Well, you just you did a voluntary transfer.
But I didn't contribute to the production of the hot dog.
It was productive, though.
But I didn't contribute to the production of the hot dog.
Why you can't distinguish between two cases, but it was productive, right? You got your desires satisfied.
I'm just trying to get down whether it's rent seeking right now.
You're not. You're trying to play.
I didn't.
You're trying to waste my time again.
Fucking hell. You gave me the definition of rent seeking, and I'm attacking this definition, and you just can't handle it. You just instantly, expand the definition. You're a fucking peacock.
Which is what you always do because it's all you're capable of because you lack the knowledge to actually hold this discussion.
I didn't. Yes or no? Did I contribute to the production of the hot dog?
You're being impertinent and educated because it bothers you that I'm talking down to you as you deserve.
Did I contribute to the production of the hot dog? You fucking retard.
Hot dog, right? I buy a hot dog.
Did I or did I not?
I give him money. He gives me a hot dog. As far as I can tell, that's pretty hard to not be a voluntary.
Did I contribute to the production of the hot dog I am now profiting from. Yes or no? Did I?
Yes, you're saying that it has to be. You're assuming that it has to be propter hoc instead of post hoc. Yeah, I did. I paid for the fucking hot dog.
So you've contributed to its production because you paid for it.
Yeah.
So that counts as contributing to its production.
Why is that
okay.
hard?
You didn't fucking answer it 5 minutes ago, so apparently it's hard for you as well. Okay, so it counts if you pay for something, then you contributed to its production. So what would be an example of rent-seeking then?
Rent-seeking is when I take my big company and I go to the government and I say, I'll happy if I pay your, I'll contribute this much to your account if you'll pass this law that grants my company these particular privileges.
What about in the free market, i.e. without the fucking state involved?
Most of these problems exist because of the state. In the free market,
so if only we were anarchists.
In the free market, it would be, the free market example would be what you consider, what is the term for it? If you're I'm a gangster and I come to your place and I say, I'm going to charge you protection money. And so I'm extracting the protection racket. So basically, so rent seeking is the political scale or the large scale equivalent of God, what's the name of? I'm forgetting the terms. Need more coffee.
Protection rackets.
Coercive. Just kidding me. Anyway, small scale coercion.
Okay, so now we have what rent seeking is. It's stuff like, gangsters coming and going for protection money. How does Rothbardian ethics incentivize rent seeking?
You there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Yes. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Are you there?
I got the same. Yeah, give me a second. I don't know. I had a sound problem over here.
Okay.
I'm getting.
Whilst you sort that out, do you mind if I go to the toilet?
Go ahead. I'm going to get a glass of water.
Okay. See you in a bit. Fucking hell. Hello there, are you back yet?
I'm here.
There we go, cool. So, we have down what... Is your audio working fine right now?
It appears to be.
Cool. So we have down what rent-seeking is. It's like the gangsters getting protection money. But how does Rothbardian ethics incentivize rent-seeking?
Lost you again. What is going on here?
Um,
There you go. You're back.
it might
What
be.
is toggling here?
Hold on.
Is something going on with were you on Discord?
Yeah, we're Discord. I've turned off where it's automatically detecting my input sensitivity, so that might help.
All right. Okay, where are we?
So we were looking at. So we've got down what rent seeking is. Now we want to determine how Rothbardian ethics incentivizes rent seeking.
It doesn't prohibit it at all. Matter of fact, so we haven't we covered. See what have we touched on? We've touched on blackmail, and we've touched on the foundations of morality, objective morality. We've touched on the distribution of moral portfolios. We've touched on um, blackmail, and we just went over rent seeking, but that's not enough of a curve. So it's not enough of a series. The one we have to cover is fraud, is the various kinds of fraud. So we have to go between blackmail and rent seeking. We have to deal with various kinds of fraud. And then we have to go beyond. We have to go to. So then we would have to go to socialization of losses and privatization of gains, and that would probably be enough. That's an awful lot to cover, so I don't know. So I would say we have to start with the primary method that has caused our present crisis, which is the false promises baiting into hazard. So this is the example I use is the jeweler in Hartford who would sell diamond rings to poor black folk in the North End, requiring a pretty hefty deposit, and then have an escalating interest rate. And so what he would do is allow these people to get married, go repossess the diamond ring, keep their deposit and payment, and remelt the gold and reset the diamond. The most common example in history is the use of credit to buy alcohol, the use of credit to buy gambling, and the use of credit to buy prostitution. These are the three most common, but the modern version is the use of credit for general consumption. So this technique is called baiting into hazard by plausible deniability, despite that evades warranty and liability. And you'll notice that they don't allow this in Islam precisely because they're aware of it, but we allow it here. So most of the problems we face today are some version, whether they be, I mean, most games the state has played, right? And most games the left has played consist of a false promise, baiting into hazard. Well, what's a false promise? A false promise is a promise of freedom from the law, the four sets of laws of nature, and in exchange for something, current consumption, false promise. And baiting into hazard is causing you to experience costs that overwhelm your reason or intuition or whatever. So it's basically predatory lending. We don't think of a lot of government programs as predatory lending, but they are. In fact, most of what libertarians object to are some sort of predatory lending, which is eventually like, I mean, the greatest example is lending is selling your child into work or slavery so they produce so many cigarettes, but the interest rate is impossible. So your child is forever stuck making cigarettes for the extractor.
So
These are, go ahead.
Rothbardian ethics, it necessarily fails because it allows this sort of predatory lending, where you have these mean people getting people into mean contracts.
I would say it's specifically designed to allow predatory lending, and you see this in
Okay.
Blocksworth on work on Walter Blocksworth work, where he's trying, for example, you know, uh, toll roads, toll bridges, um, uh, uh, prostitution, drugs. Most of these ethics are the attempt to
Yeah, it's defending
claim
the undefendable.
what?
Defending the
Yeah,
undefendable.
I know Walter very well. It's not, so, um, uh, so most of these issues are some form of baiting into hazard. Rothbardian ethics specifically don't prohibit the forms of baiting into hazard, and they don't require warranty liability, and they specifically intentionally ignore uh, externalities, right? The externalities produced by these behaviors, and they specifically ignore productivity, like we see in the requirement for blackmail and various other schemes. So, what Rothbardian ethics are is a half truth. In other words, of because I always fell for them, right? They're a half truth that tells you what you want, you believe, without thinking through what this really is doing compared to European ethics. And even European ethics are clearly failed because we don't prohibit baiting into hazard. Most of my work based on uh, outlawing baiting into hazard by the state and corruption, this kind of stuff. So I mean, the end result of my work is understand. In other words, Rothbard helped me understand what was wrong by understanding that he was explicitly missing something. The way Hoppe made me understand something was wrong by his argumentation ethics and his argument against Popper. So it's not like these guys didn't contribute. I said me, Hoppe, and Rothbard solved social science in 3 generations. But it's not because Rothbard or Hoppe are right. It's because they were half right in many of these ways and half wrong in others. So Rothbard's ethics, specifically, I had to figure out what bothered me about them, what was wrong, and so I just went through it until I understood what was going on, and I expanded the scope of it. So Rothbard's ethics don't allow you to create a high trust society, and they are as prohibitive on the formation of commons as Marxism is on the prohibition on creating private sector wealth. So it's these are the basic problems with Rothbard ethics. If you were to say to me, well, I'm going to argue that non-aggression is true, but it's got to be non-aggression as what? And the problem is you have to understand all the ways people aggress. This is one of the things we see in courts, is sometimes our courts seem unfair. And that's the reason, because the court is aware of far more ways people pull shit on other people than the average person. The average person goes in there and finds himself accused of something he couldn't imagine, and he thinks this is immoral. Well, fundamentally it is, because it wasn't within his capacity to know it. And he couldn't even think of that kind of crime. But the state is keenly aware of these things. So this is the same with the libertarian ethics. It's okay for like simple stuff, right? I mean, it's an interpersonal philosophy. You can't go wrong. It's like Christianity. The problem is it doesn't scale to the polity, because people are actually fucking evil, devious, conniving fucks that invent new kinds of criminality as fast as we invent new kinds of positive behavior, productivity. I mean, people invent in schemes all the day. And if you look at where we are today, we're not in a problem because of rule of law. We're in a problem because of the insufficiency of rule of law. We're in a problem because our ancestors couldn't imagine that this kind of shit would happen at this kind of scale. But what did happen, and is that the left, which is the Jewish left, which is using the Jews using the female strategy, they developed over history natural selection process in favor of this means of profiting very much from generations of people who had higher trust societies. And so Rothbard just carried this with him because that's his mind. This is his background, just like Hoppe brought the free cities of Germany with him as his mind and his concept of moral, just like I brought Anglo natural law with me because it's my history and whatever. Rothbard and argues with Pilpul and critique. Hoppe argues with Kantian rationalism, and I argue with empirical science. These are our cultural ethics argued with the language, vocabulary, and logic that each of our cultures required to defend those prior actions. In other words, it's really important that we understand that we develop a group evolutionary strategy, then we develop a mythology or history, and we develop a logic and method of argument that justifies whatever it is that's been successful for us. Because no people go forward and say we're evil fuckers. They don't. The difference is we can tell by the natural law, we can measure the variation from natural law to Anglo, Germanic, French, Jewish, Muslim, Chinese, Hindu law. We can measure how these things vary from it. Does that mean anybody's going to change? Well, I don't know. It does mean that by making that comparison, we can look at certain groups and say, well, our law is weak because we've allowed this particular Jewish expertise to move from small scale lending and gambling and stuff that's usually in the dark side to industrial scale through the Fed. So, I mean, we can understand that we've allowed this to happen and that we can outlaw it. And it's very easy to outlaw these things. But this is the problem when I say there's a big difference between a scientific law that evolves incrementally through the discovery of irreciprocities and the belief that we can develop a single general rule that is really relatively simple. Sure, children can learn imitation ethics. Young adults can learn rule-based ethics, which is what Rothbardianism. But some of us have to be adults because we end up with large-scale responsibilities, learning about all the bad things that people do, and it's our job to stop the bad things that people do. Whereas the average person, the libertarian, the good-intentioned, well-intentioned person, is most concerned about living a good life, and the person at the bottom is just trying to get ahead. So we have, because there's a distribution of responsibilities, there's a distribution of capacities and knowledge, and because of that, there's a distribution of the criteria by which we define what is moral. I define what is moral as a judge by what is not moral, what is immoral. Somebody in the middle is going to, the majority of people are going to define what's moral is what works for them to get along and lead a happy, successful, fulfilling life and feel good about themselves. And the people at the bottom are going to try to break morality now and then because they're trying to get away with whatever they can because their station is unsatisfactory for them. So it's logical that we would all, not only would Muslims, Chinese, Hindus, Jews, um, uh, uh, Germans, French, and English develop different legal and argumentative models because we would have to. It's harder to defend more mystical, harder to defend more sophomoric, and it's harder to defend more rational, and it's easiest to defend empirical. We would all have done that, but we forget that within classes, our social classes, are lower, middle, and upper. We also develop ways of looking at morality, which fit the needs of our group. I deal with law at the macro level, legal theory. Some people, the average person, which is what you probably are trying to look for, most libertarians are good-natured people, are looking for good-natured means by which to live their life, and they want rules to justify it. And people at the bottom are looking for Marxism and whatever else they can. In other words, they're looking for a means to obtain more to justify what they wish they had. So, I mean, it's normal that people develop these differences. It's just unfortunate that each of us thinks that we need to impose our way of thinking on the others rather than understand that there's a universal set of laws underneath all of these things and that we can understand whether we're right or wrong in our given class or given civilization by looking at that system of measurement because that system of measurement is consistent and coherent with all the sciences, whether physical, behavioral, evolutionary, or the means, the logics by which we describe them.
Okay. So it allows for this, Rothbardian ethics allows for this sort of predatory lending, this rent seeking. Why does that imply that it will always fail?
Why does it imply that it will always fail? Um, That I don't. If you say, I said I had to cover. I said we covered the foundations. We covered blackmail. We covered rent seeking. I just covered baiting into hazard. I'd have to cover two more things, which I really don't know if I want to do, which is privatization of commons and privatization of commons, socialization of losses, and I would have to talk about competitive survivability. Um, so we say what happens is that each of these incremental evasions of the natural law pose an incremental friction on the organization and persistence of a polity that can compete without defection. So in other words, a Rothbardian ethics has and always will end up with essentially piracy of some analogy of it. And it will be conquered and defeated by powers that do not allow that spectrum of irreciprocities. Now, does that mean
Okay,
that you
right.
can't?
Okay, right. Wait. So your answer for why you know it this based on this the allowance of this rent seeking, it will always end up with piracy. How do you get to therefore it will always end up with piracy?
Piracy is a general term for civilizations that are sustainable only because they do not produce commons, and they parasitically depend on the production of goods, services, and commons of others. In other words, so this is the libertarian thing. If I want to go live out here, but I want to maintain the benefits of paying all the high cost of living in this fucking urban shithole, right? And so this libertarian thing, I want the benefits, but I don't want to pay the costs.
Okay, right.
Well,
What exactly are the commons? You keep producing commons, I still don't understand what you mean by producing commons.
so the first one I'll give is behavioral, right? Well, obvious are things like our territory, right? That's a common. The obvious personal stuff is my life, my stuff, my mates, and my children, right? All right, that's obvious, right? My built capital, my territory, right? That's up. But the commons are those same things at scale. It's those things which I depend on. I depend on physical commons, like the fact that we hold our territory, right? The built capital, the monuments, I don't know, whatever, the infrastructure, right? All these things that make it possible, the resources, right? I depend on the informal commons, norms, traditions, values, habits, manners, ethics, those kind of things. And I depend on formal institutions, which we think of as, banks and governments and judiciaries and armies and that kind of stuff. And we depend lastly on something we ignore, which is the opportunities created by all three, the personal, uh, the physical, informal, and formal commons. In other words, when we come together in large numbers, what's generally happening, what's happening is we're reducing opportunity costs, because time and space is the primary opportunity cost. So we come together, we produce opportunity costs, and then regular rules reduce the risk. There was reduced frictions. And so if you think of it as
So
a via negativa, we reduce opportunity costs, we further reduce opportunity costs, and then we reduce transaction costs, and therefore our
right.
goal is to produce the
Okay.
lowest of those costs that produce the highest returns.
So you're saying that the Rothbardian society is parasitic of these commons. I mean, would it not allow for the production of, these monuments, children, capital goods, territory? Would it not allow for the production of these things? Why does it necessarily have to be parasitic?
Because this is why do people free ride?
Oops, sorry, I've
If
got an
you had,
alarm going off. Hold on. Sorry about that. So why does it have to be parasitic of, say, mates, your property, children, built capital, territory? Why does it have to be parasitic of these things rather than producing these things?
There's two basic. I think there's two or three basic causes. I'm getting tired, so I don't know if I can stack them in my head all at once. The first is that people need an incentive to come somewhere. They move places that have opportunities. There's a difference between people who move somewhere to live a hippie or libertarian lifestyle, and people who live somewhere because it can help them increase their capital. So what happens is you have to be able to create demand for population and for capital investment and for preservation of capital investment. To do that, you have to be able to create commons that are desirable for people to move to and stay in, because otherwise they will leave. Then you have to be able to, if you scale, you have to create commons sufficient to preserve marginal workers. So the problem is you end up with the problem of the state, because what occurs is that a lot of these commons are incredibly expensive. Everybody wants the benefits of them, but nobody wants to pay for them. So the problem isn't, and I would argue that libertarians are right, the problem isn't that we wouldn't produce this commons, libertarians wouldn't produce this commons. The problem is, until we have the natural law codified as I've done here, you can't limit the commons to those that are actually not parasitic, rent-seeking, privatization, or baiting people into hazard. So is retirement funds baiting people into hazard versus forcing their savings? Absolutely. Right? I mean, is paying unwed mothers for their children baiting into hazard? Absolutely. I mean, what most of them object to is things that bait us into hazard, or what we consider rent-seeking, which is organizations that seek privilege at our expense. So our law is just insufficient to protect us from those things. So in that sense, in a libertarian polity, if our laws were such to defend against those things, we would be able to produce what we call a libertarian polity. The difference is it would look like natural law. It wouldn't look, in other words, as I've described it, it wouldn't look like permissive law like Rothbard described it. Because there's no means in Rothbard for prohibiting those things that allow populations to scale. So you end up with is all the malcontents living out there, which is what happens.
So the problem with Rothbardian ethics is not that it could not produce the commons, it's that it cannot exclude people from the commons who are parasitic, right?
Correct. So if you just say Rothbardian ethics are necessary but insufficient to produce a survivable polity, that's the right answer. And so my problem is people argue with me with the sufficiency clause. And it's the same thing I get from constitutionalists. Well, if they just obeyed the law, well, no, the Constitution's weak. I can point out the eight holes in it. They're really fucking obvious in retrospect, and they can be fixed. What's the problem with Rothbardian ethics? As low trust ethics, they're fine. They just are low. They're just the minimum ethics. They're ethics against
if they're
stealing, violence and stealing, but they're not against all the kinds of indirect stealing.
If they're necessary but not sufficient, surely that means that you're basically defining a subset of Rothbard's ethics, i.e., we still have it that you shouldn't aggress.
I'm saying Rothbard's ethics are a subset of those necessary to complete the definition of natural law sufficient to produce the kind of society libertarians desire.
Well, but that would make it a superset, i.e., it would be the bedrock. If you had Rothbardian ethics, you'd have everything you need to make a libertarian society, but not everything. You might want a little bit more. Right, so you still have to have non-aggression.
I won't give you that. I'll give you that you have the Rothbardian ethics sound really good if you have state protection. If you live in a borderland and you have state protection or empire protection.
But if you have state protection, that is coming at the expense of taxation, which violates Rothbardian ethics, which would mean Rothbardian ethics aren't necessary, because you have the violation of Rothbardian ethics in your taxation.
Taxation, if it is fees, is not a violation of Rothbardian ethics.
Oh, taxation is absolutely a violation of Rothbardian ethics because it's not fees, it's theft.
Well, it's only if I get a group of people together and I say I'm going to for you to enjoy the benefits of proximity to the rest of us, you must pay this fee. Is that a fee or is that a tax? Well, it's a tax.
Well, no, if you are having people agree to some sort of, club due or whatever, then that's not a tax. But that is not what the state does. The state is saying we are forcing you to pay this.
You have to leave if you don't pay it, right?
But the state doesn't own the land. You're allowed to say you have to leave if you don't pay this. If you own the property, if you have the property right.
I just get a bunch of guys together and we capture this incredible piece of territory. Right, this beautiful
right, but that would be you actually own that territory. If you actually homestead that territory, then you're allowed to do that. That is not what the state does.
A state is just a corporation.
The state doesn't. No, the state is not just a corporation. This is what the public choicers get wrong. The state is not just like another company. It is specifically different. It is anti-productive. It lives in the anti-productive sector of the economy. It is expropriating people.
Go to find a place without a state and see what happens. That's not what happens.
Oh, yeah. Irrelevant. The state has taken over everything. Who cares? What is the relevance here?
This is a pointless conversation. What else? What were we talking about before? I was trying to cover that we would have, if we wanted to be able to talk about the sufficiency of ethics, we'd have to talk enough of the spectrum to prohibit sophistry upon this spectrum.
No. We are talking about necessary bits of not sufficient. So if Rothbardian ethics are necessary, you necessarily have to adhere by Rothbardian ethics. You did say that Rothbardian ethics were necessary but not sufficient.
You're twisting my meaning.
No. You said that. So Rothbardian ethics are necessary but not sufficient.
Stop wasting my time. Just listen.
How about you stop fucking saying things you don't believe in?
Stop
doing that.
When I said that Rothbardian ethics, what I meant was the scope of Rothbardian ethics is necessary and sufficient. That's what I meant, because in my mind, I'm using the graph of incremental suppression. So if I said Rothbardian ethics, I meant the scope of Rothbardian ethics.
What does it mean to be the scope of Rothbardian ethics? What do you mean by that?
The scope of suppression of irreciprocity stated in Rothbardian ethics is insufficient for the production of a survivable polity. And I'm right.
So the scope of, what did you say? The scope?
That's what ethics are.
The scope of suppression of reciprocity is necessary and sufficient.
No. Let's try it again. Don't interrupt me.
Fucking Christ, bro. Say what you want to say, and just don't fuck it up this time. Just don't fuck it up this time. You said the Rothbardian ethics are necessary but not sufficient before. You said this before. So just say what you actually believe. Fucking Christ.
That's what I said. That's what I meant to say. You interpret it.
Yeah, you're not being precise in your fucking language.
Is included in what I referred to. Now you can't claim that I said what I didn't mean to say. You can only.
All right, I'll edit this down in the future, and I will juxtapose these two clips of you saying you didn't say that Rothbardian ethics are necessary but not sufficient, right next to you saying that Rothbardian ethics are necessary but not sufficient, and we'll see what happens.
I said it's one thing to say it. It's one thing to what I meant.
Right, yeah, we can see the clips in the future. I'll send you them. I'll send you the edit of this with you just contradicting yourself, will I?
And you'll be constructing a fraud, right?
I'll be constructing a fraud with your words only.
Right, by misrepresenting what I said.
My
I just clarified what I said. I just clarified what I meant.
You clarified it by adding fucking a whole salad dressing on top of it.
The scope of ethics that stated by Rothbard are insufficient. That's what I meant to say. Now, if I said something shorthand to that, because you're always nagging me about shorthand, That's fine. If you misrepresent that, you're just doing what I said, which
concise
is
without being
you're just
incorrect.
another Rothbardian
You can
scumbag.
be
I want to know
concise
whether
without being incorrect.
you are honest, intellectually honest enough to understand that that's what I meant to say.
Curt,
I meant to say
being
that
concise
the scope
is
of Rothbardian ethics are
it's the
necessary
soul
but
of wit,
insufficient.
right?
That's what I meant to say. That's what's logical to say. That it's not what you want to project I meant to say. You can try to
Brevity is the soul of wit,
meaning
right?
by projecting into what you think I meant to say, or you can simply ask me for clarification. But projecting your
I ask you for
defeats off of it
clarification,
is
and then you go into a whole
lying.
fucking 3-hour
You're just
rant.
lying, and you're just lying.
I'm not lying. I'm using your words against you.
Exactly. You're using what's called a constructivist lie by misrepresentation, by not asking for clarification of what I meant, and then when I clarified, stating that what
necessary but not sufficient is very clear. I think you just realize you fucked up. I think you realize you fucked up, and you are trying to backtrack. I think you realize you fucked up.
I didn't fuck up. Why would that be a fuck up? It's clear that you ran away with something that I didn't intend. It was only once you ran away with it that I said, how the fuck did you get that from there? And then I said, okay, I see what he did. He thought I meant that he didn't understand that I meant that the scope, I said Rothbardian ethics are necessary. I didn't say the scope of Rothbardian. Well, I should have said the scope, but that's all. It's not that I fucked up. It's that you're attempted to set.
No. You also changed necessary but not sufficient into necessary and sufficient.
You're a liar.
You changed both parts of it, though.
No, I didn't. I clarified a position. There's no change.
I remember this.
You lied.
I was there.
Yeah, I know. And you're trying to create a lie, which is what you do.
We'll see when I edit this down, won't we? We will, won't we?
When I tell people that the purpose of Abrahamic deception is to do exactly this, the purpose of Rothbardian argument is to do exactly this. You are, and the purpose of Christian.
What you should do is you should put my live stream as necessary reading for all of your courses, and then they'll all watch it through, and we'll see, won't we?
Either the audience understands that what I said was very
clear. The audience is way on my side. I have about 3 pictures of you pissing yourself on the screen right now. The audience is way on my side.
Okay. So either the audience understands that when I said Rothbardian ethics, I should have clarified, because later you clearly ran with it. I should have clarified by saying the scope of Rothbardian ethics.
Not only that, I asked about Rothbardian ethics, not the scope of it.
Then I said the scope of Rothbardian ethics.
I asked about Rothbardian ethics specifically.
Right, that's okay. And then you went and ran with it. And then when you ran with it, I realized that the reason you were able to pull your deceit was because
my deceit. I was going just in good faith with what we had established before, and I was deceiving you.
The whole conversation is try to engage.
Jesus Christ.
I know what you're doing. It's just the reason to do this is so that my people can learn how liars like you work. That's the reason.
And your people can see you pissing yourself 3 times on my screen if they want.
We show how easy it is for people. It should be obvious that it takes about 4 years to learn and master a scientific discipline. Well, what it takes is about 4 years for us. I'm going through and trying to give you a crash course in a discipline, and you're trying to use childish tactics on me. And
by childish tactics, mean argumentation.
I'm being good-natured and going with it.
You are not being good-natured, my friend.
And I'm just calling you out whenever you pick up some childish little tactic. And so this childish tactic is yet again, you have gone and tried to say, oh, you said this. And I said, well, I said that, but it's a pretty shorthand statement. When most of the time, what I do is I give really long explanations. This time I didn't, for God knows why. And then when I said, holy shit, how did he come up with that? Oh, I see. I meant the scope of Rothbardian support. So,
can you confirm whether it's you who is pissing yourself in the famous images? Can you confirm whether that's you?
So, in other words, you can't engage in this conversation.
I mean, if we're done with the conversation, do you agree that it was you who was pissing in these images?
Conversation because I've won.
Do you think you've won?
That's the reason.
If you
You
want, if
know
you want
I've
to keep
won, right? I mean, I've
bloviating,
illustrated you're a shameless liar,
it
and
looks
that
like
you're
you were
just a
pissing
sophist
here.
trying to play word games.
Do you want to
And I've
send
shown
this to
you
your
for three
followers
hours,
to show them that you're
and,
pissing
and
yourself?
now you have to resort to ad homs because you know that
This is
I'm
not an
right,
ad hom.
and you know that I've
It's
crushed you,
why is
and you
this an
know that
ad hom?
I've demonstrated
Why is it an
thoroughly
ad hom
that
to
your
point
whole
out that you're
belief
pissing
system is
yourself?
crap.
Why is it
So
an
I'm
ad hom to point
absolutely
out that you're pissing
confident in it,
yourself?
and it's fine. So the answer is, can you testify that I pissed myself?
Did you piss yourself? Yes or no?
No, of course not.
So you didn't piss yourself. So this is not you
No, it's
pissing
just sweat.
yourself.
It's just sweat.
Just sweat. So you sweated from your only
I
in your
have
cock and balls.
I have no thyroid, and I have a whole bag full of immune system medicines because of my cancer. And so I'm not supposed to go out in hot weather. When I go out in hot weather, I have to try as hell to tolerate it. Well, I did that by drinking a lot of water and sweating like a pig. And you know what? I was there and I did work, and you didn't.
Okay, yeah.
I was there and I did work, and you didn't. You sat like a little boy in your mommy's basement.
So I was doing unproductive activity, wasn't I?
I did something. We did something. We tried. And so what you're trying to do is Jewish, feminine,
It's
gossip,
Jewish, is it?
rallying, shaming, and moralizing
Why do you
in
keep bringing
order
up
to
the
circumvent the
Jews, by
fact
the
that I've
way?
defeated you in argument. So we know what GSSRM is. We know the female method of argument. We know that the Abrahamic method is just the applied female method of argument.
Yeah, for
We
sure,
know
the
that
Abrahamic method.
we know
Yeah,
that Abrahamic religions teach this method argument, and we know that the Jewish all
yeah, for
three
sure.
Jewish methods of the second Abrahamic revolution use this method, which includes Marxism, neo-Marxism, postmodernism, etc. Includes
Oh
the
yeah, no
two
doubt.
branches of libertarianism, and it includes
Yeah, for
neoconservatism,
sure.
and now it includes PC, woke, and anti-whiteness. These are
Yeah,
all methods
definitely.
of using the same Abrahamic methods of sophistry and
Yeah,
deceit.
no doubt.
And that's what we do. And so
Absolutely.
my work here is trying to outlaw it so that it's
Yeah,
criminal for people like
why
you
are
to
you
do
so
what
pissed
you're
off
doing.
by the Jews, by the way?
I'm not. I'm just trying to give the causal axis of feminine
You
to
seem
Jewish
that
strategy to
you're
that.
like,
And
this
then,
is
no,
very
because
Jewish here.
if we
You're
were in
very
a
angry
if we
whenever you
were
use the
in
word Jewish.
the 17th, 18th century, I would be
Seem
talking about the
very
French because,
angry.
of course, the French are the ones that started it. If we were in the 19th century,
Who
I
are
would
you
be talking
talking
about the
to?
Germans because
Who
the
are you
Germans
talking
went through
to
it.
right now?
But when we were in the late 19th century, we had the Jewish ones because these things are working in a very clear progress across the continent as everybody tries to adapt to the Anglo development of empiricism and the modern state. And so we went from very clearly France to Germany to Russia to the Jews, and now the post-war Jews moved from Bolshevism in the U.S. and in Europe. They brought it to here and converted it to race Marxism from class Marxism, and that's what
By the
we
way,
have.
what was the cancer medication which made you look like you pissed yourself?
The technique they use is the Abrahamic method of deceit, and the Abrahamic method of deceit is primarily dependent on two
So the
techniques.
cancer
The first
medication that you
technique
made you look
is
like you
called
pissed
pilpul,
yourself, what was
which
that?
is our kind of sophistry, and the second technique is called critique, which is undermining. So what neither of these
Was
do
it
is
piss?
propose a complete and coherent alternative
You're
that
not
simply
listening to me here, so I'm gonna
criticizes it.
just leave.
Instead,
I'm not gonna lie, guys. I think he might have pissed himself. Anyway, I'll see you later. That was very fun, wasn't it? Boop.